You're listening to No Podcast for Old Men.
Hey everyone, welcome to No Podcast for Old Men, the only podcast in the known universe wherein three university philosophy professors provide analysis of each and every Coen Brothers film in chronological order. I'm one of your three co-hosts, Robert Jones, a philosophy professor. Today is our 8th episode. That means we are going to discuss the Coen Brothers' 8th release, which was released in 2000. It created a cultural phenomenon musically. This is the madcap comedy, better known as Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Let me welcome my two co-hosts from Louisville, Kentucky, Professor Peter S. Fossil. Peter, how you feeling today?
Hi, Robert.
How you doing?
I'm good.
Just say a little bit more so people can index your voice to our...
Yeah, well, I'm sitting here in my office in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm excited to talk about the way that poor whites and rural people are portrayed in the film. And yeah, it's always great to be here with you.
Let's go to Chico, California, our other co-host, Professor Troy A. Jollymore. Hey, Troy, how you doing today, man?
I'm smashing, Robert. I'm smashing. What can I say?
Well, let's jump right in. I think it's time for the brief opening statement on what we think the film is about. We usually go to Peter S. Fossil. So, Peter, why don't you start? Give us a little what you think, in a nutshell, what the movie is about.
I've just got a few things. I mean, it's a film about friendship, isn't it? And three friends, three male white friends, and a fourth black sidekick, but there's a kind of correspondence to the Big Lebowski and the trio there, the troika. In the case of the Big Lebowski, I don't want to get too much in the comparison. We'll do it later, but they're fighting one thing, and I think they're fighting maybe another thing here, and that's an interesting thing to think about. Or their adversaries are different. It's a movie about fate and chance and religion and how those play out. This will tie into discussions we've had in the past about the Coen brothers and determinism and freedom. And I think, that's certainly here. It's about looking for answers and who has answers and who pretends to have answers. It's a film about skepticism about others. There's people who present themselves one way, but we find are others, and how that turns out and how that affects things. And it's a film about whiteness, I think. It's about whiteness and how it plays out, of course, in that time period, but I think more broadly, even the time period that it's made as well. So friendship, fate, chance, religion, head, heart, answers and who has them and who doesn't, and others in whiteness. So that's my little lightning round.
Thank you. That was great, Peter S. Fossil. Let's go to Troy Jollymore. They're in Chico, California.
Yeah, I'm going to say it's a film about home, about what home is and what it means, how you get there. Drawing on classic works about homeward bound heroes, The Odyssey, The Wizard of Oz. It's a film about circular journeys, leaving and coming back, and therefore about restoration, the restoration of a paterfamilias to his rightful place at the head of a household, or at least that's how he sees it. The restoration of one's soul to its original state of innocence. And forms of political restoration, I think, as well, that we'll probably get into later. I think it's a film about success and salvation and what these mean in American culture, what it is to be bona fide. Like their earlier film, Raising Arizona, its central characters are men who have run afoul of the law, and in doing so have endangered their own ability to fit comfortably into society, but who nonetheless have admirable and redeeming qualities. They seek redemption and forgiveness, sometimes by religious means, but in the end, this being America, it's celebrity and material success that restore them to a state of acceptance and legitimacy. It's a film about the way truth and politics bend themselves to fit the beliefs of an uneducated voting public and the values of American celebrity culture. It's about how American politics is showbiz, whether it's a little person with a broom, a bunch of men in fake beards singing old-timey music, or a finely choreographed Ku Klux Klan rally whose intended climax is the lynching of an innocent man. It's a film about freedom, as Peter mentioned. Like Raising Arizona, it asks whether family is just another kind of prison. Like The Big Lebowski, it holds up male friendship as a kind of ideal relationship in a difficult world. And it's a film about justice, the stories that we try to tell to make the world seem just. It's one of the very few Coen films to actually be set in a just universe. But it's also a film that undermines that message by constantly calling attention to its own artificiality and unreality, reminding us that the world it depicts is not the world we actually live in. It's a fairy tale. So like every Coen film, at least since Barton Fink, it's a film about story, narrative, and myth. It invokes ancient Greek myths while treating them so playfully that we can't take that very seriously. It throws together religious stories and doctrines, American folk tales, plot allusions to films like The Wizard of Oz and Sullivan's Travels. It's a film about our deep need to tell stories about the world that make it seem like a just and friendly place. I think, like The Wizard of Oz, it's a film that's basically a dream. And all told, I think maybe it's not that far off from the dream that High has at the end of Raising Arizona. Well, I'll leave it there. We'll, I'm sure, come back to a lot of that.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah.
Another great lightning round from Peter and Troy, and lots to think about. I'll give my little lightning round. A lot of it, as usual, you guys cover some of the stuff, a lot of the stuff I was going to say. But I have a little list here. Let me go through it. So my nutshell version of what the movie is about. Of course, it's a road picture, and as Peter said, it's a buddy movie. It's kind of a hayseed epic, if you will. It is a film about poverty and racism and the carceral state. It's a film about a dark time among many dark times in American history. It's also a kind of Socratic discourse on capitalism and family and friendship and civic responsibility in American politics. I think it's also a film about relationships, about the interconnectedness and the kind of interdependency that we often ignore, especially in American individualistic culture. So this is a theme I want to come back to with regard to, say, feminist care ethics. It's not really a feminist film or a feminine film, if you will, but at the heart of it is this interconnected interdependency relationship issue. So I think that's important. It's also, to me, a film about anti-intellectualism versus knowledge. I'm interested in discussing, where do the Coens come down on this? Are they on the side of anti-intellectualists? I don't know. It's also a film about belief versus knowledge, as we've seen with many Coen brothers films. The conflict between having a rational worldview and a world in which you believe in, as Sagan would call it, the demon-haunted world. It's also a film about the struggle between capital and labor. I think this is a film about music. It's not only a film about music, it's a film about how music has a liberatory force in the same way that the truth will set you free. In this film, the music will set you free. Lastly, it's a zany, cartoonish, madcap comedy rife with Three Stooges-esque slapstick. It is a film, as Troy, you pointed out, takes the pattern of Homer's epic, loss, recovery, wandering, return. And it's a film that asks a question that many of the Coen brothers films have asked, including The Big Lebowski, and that is masculinity. What is it to be a man? And lastly, Troy, you touched on this as well. Is it a critique of marriage, or is it a film that celebrates family unity, and is it an affirmation of marriage? I don't quite know, but it has something to do with that stuff. Anyway, those are my brief opening comments on what the film is about.
Excellent.
Nice.
Thanks, Rob.
Sounds like we have some things to talk about.
Something to talk about. And now it is time for Troy Jollymore, our summary expert. Troy Jollymore, can you provide us with a summary of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Take it away, Troy.
Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? From 2000, starring George Clooney, John Turturro, and Tim Blake Nelson. The film is set in Mississippi in 1937, apparently, begins with a little chain gang musical number out in the hot sun, first of several musical numbers we'll get in this film. Then immediately focuses on our three heroes, Ulysses Everett McGill, generally referred to as Everett, Pete, and Delmar, who are fleeing said chain gang through the beautiful fields of Depression-era America, and in particular, again, Mississippi. We learn that they're on their way to Everett's home, where a treasure awaits, a big stash of money that he hid before he went to prison. They only have a short time to retrieve this treasure because the area is scheduled to be flooded. In a few days, that treasure will be at the bottom of a lake. They meet several interesting characters along the way. The first one is a blind seer on a railroad handcar who claims to have no name and makes some interesting, if somewhat obscure, predictions. The three men are being pursued by agents of the law, and in particular by the cool, cruel, and implacable Sheriff Cooley. Cooley and his men almost manage to catch them after Pete's cousin betrays them and reports their presence in his barn to the lawmen. But they manage to escape with the help of the cousin's son. Soon after, they encounter a baptism procession, which Delmar and Pete join enthusiastically, in part under the mistaken impression that getting baptized into the Christian faith will cleanse their legal records as well. Everett, ever the skeptic, hangs back and provides ironic commentary. They then pick up a hitchhiker, Tommy Johnson, who happens to be a pretty good guitar player. He should be. He sold his soul to the devil the night before for that guitar picking skill. The four of them happen into a radio/recording studio where, under the moniker Soggy Bottom Boys, they lay down a track, an old-timey piece titled Man of Constant Sorrow. As they continue their travels, their record finds an audience and becomes a smash hit. Of course, they have no idea. They're pretty much avoiding contact with civilization because, again, they're being pursued. They're not listening to the radio very much. So they have no idea that they've essentially become pop stars. After another close call with the cops, Tommy departs. The trio continues to encounter interesting characters. First, a bank robber, George Babyface Nelson, who takes them along for a robbery. Following that, the Sirens, a triad of temptresses who, it seems, get the boys drunk and have their siren-y way with them. When the boys wake up the next morning, they are down one Voyager. Pete is gone, replaced, it seems, or maybe transformed into a toad. That's Delmar's theory anyway. Everett's a little more skeptical. Later still, they encounter Big Dan, a one-eyed Bible salesman who takes them to a picnic, then beats them up, steals their money, and crushes the life out of said toad. While all this is going on, we're also being given intermittent glimpses into an ongoing Mississippi gubernatorial campaign, which has incumbent Pappy O'Daniel running an ailing campaign against the younger challenger Homer Stokes. Okay, that toad that got squashed, by the way, was not Pete, despite the resemblance. Pete had been apprehended by Cooley's men, who whipped him and threatened to hang him, and by doing so got him to tell them where Everett and Delmar were headed. They all re-encounter each other in a movie theater during a showing of a Three Stooges film. Around this time, Everett locates his wife, Penny, and three of their daughters at a campaign event for Homer Stokes. The reunion is not the one Everett wanted, as Penny claims that their marriage is over and tells him that she's engaged to Vernon Waldrop, who turns out to be Homer Stokes' campaign manager. Shortly after that, Everett and Delmar rescue Pete. Everett confesses that he made up the story about the treasure to convince the other two to join in his escape scheme. There is, in fact, no treasure. Pete is enraged. He only had 2 weeks left on his sentence. The three of them then happen upon a Klan rally and see Tommy Johnson, who is about to be lynched by a group of Klansmen, including both Big Dan and, again, the gubernatorial candidate, Homer Stokes. They manage to rescue Tommy while crushing Big Dan under a flaming cross. Everett still intends to win Penny back and establish himself as the bona fide paterfamilias of his family. They disguise themselves as musicians and sneak into a Stokes campaign event. When they launch into a performance of Man of Constant Sorrow, the crowd surprises them by going wild. Homer Stokes recognizes them as the miscreants/social justice warriors who disrupted an otherwise perfectly pleasant Klan rally and denounces them to the crowd. But the celebrity-struck crowd knows that in America, fame transcends all. They angrily throw Stokes out, basically ending his campaign. Stokes' opponent, the incumbent Pappy O'Daniel, seizes the moment and recruits the Soggy Bottom Boys to his campaign, guaranteeing for himself an electoral victory, and in the act pardoning them of all prior offenses. Given the upheaval and reversal, Penny shrewdly switches her own allegiances as well, recognizing that Everett is clearly a better bet than Vernon Waldrop, at least for the time being. All Everett needs now is to retrieve Penny's wedding ring, which is, she thinks, in the drawer of a roll-top desk in their old cabin, which happens to be in the area that's scheduled to be flooded. So the Soggy Bottom Boys, including Tommy, go to get it, only to find that Sheriff Cooley and his men are there waiting for them and plan to hang them. This hardly seems fair. After all, our heroes have had their legal records cleared, and at least 2 of them have recently been baptized to boot. How much more salvation could anybody possibly ask for? Well, just as it looks like they've reached the end of the road, the valley is flooded. Cooley and his men are washed away in the deluge, but our 4 heroes survive, clinging to various bits of floating flotsam. Everett returns to Penny and gives her the ring, only it turns out it's the wrong ring, and Penny says she won't marry him until he finds the right one. And the film ends with an image of their girls tied together in a row that mirrors the opening image of the chain gang, and the blind seer, also from the start of the film, who is singing along with the girls to the song Angel Band as he recedes down the track toward the horizon.
Excellent.
Nice. Another Troy Jollimore tour de force summary. Well, that's good. That's good. It's time to sort of start to dig in, peel the onion, if you will. And this is where we talk about the political / social / cultural themes. Peter S. Vossel, what do you think? What do you got for us in the political, social, cultural situation of the film?
I mean, there's so much to start with here. Of course, it's made in 2000, which is the end of the Clinton era, and George Bush is about to take over there. It's set in 1937, and that's an interesting year. That was the year in the Depression when there was the most strikes. So it's a moment of labor unrest in the Depression. It's, of course, the FDR era and the New Deal era, and the backdrop to this is the flooding of a valley by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Of course, they don't flood quite the way as depicted in the film, but yeah, there's that. And it's interesting that in a way that the FDR policies defeat evil in this case. And there's this larger, I think, background question about how the federal government is going to come in and, in some people's readings, help facilitate the end of segregation in the South later, of course. Yeah, but let's talk about race. I think there are other little things about populism. And I do think, well, I should mention this before I forget it. There's a little curious thing that I'd like to talk to you about where the Soggy Bottom Boys end up not on the side of the reform candidate, whom we find is actually a deep and hardened racist, but still might be a kind of populist, a sort of Willie Long populist, and he ends up on the side of O'Daniel. What's his politics? It seems like he moves with the wind, like Bill Clinton did in a way, but he presents himself, at least in the beginning, as the opposite of the reform candidate. So there's this question raised about whether the Soggy Bottom Boys have sold out to the powerful, big bosses of the time there. I mean, it helped them personally, I guess, but there's moment in that weird moment that seems strange to me. But let's talk about race. So, interestingly, when we meet them at the recording studio, Everett describes the group as black. They've already picked up the sort of Robert Johnson type character, Tommy, and who's sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads. But then, of course, they as soon as they figure out that the blind recording guy would rather not record black music in a moment of sort of racist exclusion, they say, "Oh no, we're white." And in fact, most of the music is very white in the film. Even the old timey music, I think, is very, very white. But later, and of course, they meet the magical Negro on the tracks, who's a kind of troubling, trope, but he plays a kind of Tiresias figure, and he gives them their fate and their future.
Peter, can I just interject quickly?
Yeah.
Can you explain who Tiresias?
Oh yeah. Well, it's just a blind seer. He's a blind seer. Yeah.
From the Odyssey. Yes.
Excuse me. I'm sorry.
Just for those listeners, I know there's probably only a couple listeners who haven't read the entire Odyssey, and for those
Right.
for those two, I just wanted to clarify
yeah.
the Tiresias trope. Anyway, please continue, Peter. I'm sorry.
Well, anyway, you get the magical Negro, but then they are said to be black when they free Tommy from the KKK. They're identified as colored. The color guard is colored, as you'll recall. And when they were liberating Pete, they put on blackface, and they're wearing that blackface for quite a while after that. When they perform the Soggy Bottom Boys, they're accused of being miscegenated, of having been, of not being pure white blood, plus being integrated with Tommy on guitar. So in a way, they've positioned themselves both by accident and intentionally as black musicians. And one wonders if there's a kind of appropriation in that, or what's going on with that. I wanted to talk to you about, like, what the hell's going on with all that? Are they experiencing, blackness? These are white guys experiencing blackness. I mean, for a film that's so much about whiteness and blackness, there isn't that much black people in it, and there's not much black music in it, as you would think there. So what's that saying about the film and about what the Coens are trying to say about race? So I wanted to raise that, and I point those things out, and my sense is that there is this kind of sellout to the powerful, and that there is this attempt of whites to appropriate, black positionality, you might say, which I wonder if you think the Coens are being critical of that, or if they succumb to it themselves. But my own sense is they're probably critical of that. Although in a way, the Coens, sometimes I wonder if they're just, another bunch of white liberals, and they think of the film as being, progressive in this way, about blacks living in solidarity with Southern whites and overcoming racism. There's a fantastic moment in the film where the racism is overcome by white music, with a dash of black guitar playing in there, right? So sometimes I think, liberals have that kind of view, in the same way they have the stereotypes about Appalachian people and rural, white people too. So I haven't decided, but I'm kind of on the side trying to give them the charity of criticizing all the way that whites appropriated blackness in that musical context, but maybe they've succumbed to it as a kind of ersatz progressive egalitarianism on the part of the trio, the troika. So is there anything else I want to say about politics? And that's a big thing to talk about there. I mean, there is some general just political bits there where, Bill Clinton identified himself as the first black president, right? So was Bill Clinton an example of this kind of ersatz appropriation of liberal whiteness taking on the blackface of blackness, something like that? So there may be a comment on the Clinton era there. Now, I just want to say more generally, they're attacked by the state, by individuals, by private organizations, by women per se, women, categorically, and men too, of course, but maybe not categorically, and by racism. So they face all these kind of adversaries, and when we get to the philosophical things, we'll talk about how maybe their friendship makes it possible for maybe their whiteness to overcome these adversaries. That is the state, again, individuals, organizations, women, and racism. So that's my start on the politics, and take it away from there.
Boy, there's a lot to say about that. I do think that, at least to a little degree, I could see there could be room for criticizing the Coens somewhat on making a movie on these topics. And as you say, that doesn't have a lot of blackness or a lot of black characters and so on in it. The ones that are there are mostly insubstantial. And so I'm not going to, defend them 100% and say there's no worries here at all or anything like that. We can separate the issues of are they appropriating or are they opportunistic or something from the issues of the character behavior. And I think it's easier to make some statements about the character's behavior. And in particular, I want to go back to a couple of the moments that you mentioned, Peter. I was really struck myself this time around watching it, and it had been a few years since I'd seen it, by how opportunistic these heroes are. I mean, they're certainly the protagonist of the film. I think it's fair to call them the heroes. I think it's fair because we are clearly expected to sympathize and identify with them and want them to prevail at the end, which they do, and that feels like a happy ending. So, and we admire them in some ways, and part of what we're seeing is they're deep down fundamentally pretty good people. We like them, we care about them. But they are very flawed, and one of the ways in which they are very flawed is how opportunistic they are, which comes across in both of these moments that you mentioned. First of all, the moment in the recording studio where it becomes clear again that this blind guy who's running things and who will pay people to sing into a can, as they say, isn't interested in black music. So he's not going to hire them if they're black. He's not interested in black music. And so, of course, at first, when Everett thinks the opposite, he says, oh, yeah, we're all black. Well, except for, I don't even know why they mentioned that Tommy isn't, except that, well, he's not what we are. So I guess we'll throw that in. But then it becomes clear that, no, it's better if you're not black. And so immediately they revert to the truth, not because it's the truth, but because that's the convenient thing, right? That's what's going to get them paid. And then something very similar, I think, goes on at the end.
Whiteness gets them paid.
Whiteness gets them paid, of course. And at the end, when Pappy O'Daniel comes onto the stage, first of all, Pappy himself is clearly being opportunistic, right? Homer Stokes, the challenger, the clear racist, because he's actually in the Klan, so he's the worst of the two. But I don't think either of them are great. Homer Stokes is saying, oh, yeah, they're miscegenated, they're this, they ain't white, and so on, right? Pappy's looking at them sort of puzzled and saying, but they's integrated. Or I guess, no, that's one of his advisors, I think, but they's integrated. And then Pappy says, well, folks don't seem to care that they's integrated, right? It doesn't matter. It's not that he's making a moral calculation here, right? What's better? I care about integration. I support it, so I'm going to go with that. It's just that the crowd's clearly on the side of these people. And so he's going to be on their side or get them on his side so that he can get the political advantage. But I think that the calculation that the Soggy Bottom Boys then make is just as opportunistic, right? Look, here's our chance to clear our records and get away with something. They probably don't even know what this guy's politics are. I don't think they're thinking on that level. They're just going to grab this chance that's been offered them, and so they take it. And so this very quick political allegiance is formed sort of out of nowhere. All these guys sort of get what they want. And as far as the public goes, I have to say, I don't really think they're thinking morally either. I sort of remembered this film in a bit of a different way, at least that sequence. I think I remembered it as being that the crowd was sort of fundamentally benevolent or good and they're non-racist or something. I don't think the crowd is thinking about racism or any of that in any way, which on one level is good. They're not thinking about race, right? So in that way, it's good. Like, they're not judging them by race. They don't care. But I just think what's really going on is these people are celebrities, right? As soon as they realize, oh, this is this band that we've been hearing on the radio, these are celebrities, they're on their side and they don't care what they've done, right? They're criminals. Well, who cares? The past is the past. Celebrities play by different rules, right? This is America. So I think the public support for them really has very little to do with anything political or moral. And I'm not even sure how aesthetic
and they
it
love
is.
the art.
I wonder if that's what I was just about to say. I don't even know about that. That's how I remember. And there's something to that. But I ended up feeling, maybe I've just become more cynical in the last few years. I ended up feeling like more than the music itself, what they really loved was seeing celebrities. It's just the fact that these people are famous and successful that really excited them. It's when they're identified as the Soggy Bottom Boys, right, that everybody gets excited. So
I mean, I may be wrong, but I found that to be like, kind of precious little moment, to tell you the truth. I think that the crowd would have been a lot different in that time and place. But,
of course. Yes.
It's like the son, or I guess it's the son of what's his, Daniel. It's like, they don't seem to mind that they're integrated. Well, yeah, I mean,
right.
Let's dream on.
Of course, it's a fairy tale, Peter. Yeah, it's not historical. Right, exactly, We have to accept. Yeah, none of this stuff would have really happened this way. So it's a sort of a fable about what might have, and it's about commerce and art and politics and all of it coming together. But even read on that level, I see it a little more cynical than I used to.
Yeah, they use whiteness to get their record contract in the first place, but then they use their sort of, I don't know, progressive racial progressive position to get pardoned. I mean, so it's a kind of interesting trajectory from the beginning to the end there, in terms of their use of race.
Or they just use their celebrity to get pardoned. But yeah, right.
Yeah, well, race is so big. I mean, it's the big thing that Homer Stokes. And by the way, I wondered if there was an allusion to Carl Stokes, who was the first the first black man to be mayor of a major city, Cleveland, I think, in '67, or was it Detroit? I don't know, one of the two. But at any rate, Stokes was an interesting name to hear me. But he says, after he gets really reaches his crescendo, he says, "These boys is not white." I mean, that's his grenade. That's his big punch. That's his haymaker to try to knock him down. It's an appeal to racial solidarity.
I don't disagree with you, Troy, with regard to the celebrity having the power to rein in the crowd. But this goes back to the theme that I was talking about earlier, which is the power of music to sort of liberate. And I don't want to attribute it totally to being awestruck or starstruck with celebrity. I think the song Man of Constant Sorrow, it's a powerful song, and the people, it holds a place for them in the Depression, right? And this, I want to attribute part of the audience's turn, not solely or primarily to being starstruck, but to being like, these are the guys who produced that music that has such an important place in our lives. So I guess I'm being less cynical. which is interesting. Usually I'm too cynical.
I know. Who is this guy? Somebody's
You're a musician,
hijacked
no.
Robert's feed here.
But
No, I suspect you're right. I mean, I'm pushing it too hard. I think the cynical aspect is there, and I'm not sure if I saw it before. But I think you're right. There's also something here about the power of art that these people are connecting with.
these movements, labor movements, civil rights movements, think of how important and integral music has been to those social justice movements. So I think that's part of the strand. But I did want to go back to something that, Peter, that you mentioned about the Coen brothers and this notion of appropriation. And of course, musically, we have a whole history of appropriation, especially just thinking about from Elvis, especially in the 60s with the blues and Clapton and all this whole appropriation of Southern black music. But here's where I feel a little bit uncomfortable about the Coens. So the film is an homage, as many Coen films, to other films. There's tropes throughout Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? If you've seen any films about the South and older films about racism and black and white relations. And so the Coen brothers are borrowing from those tropes. And my fear is, and I think the Coen brothers do this, they kind of get away with appropriating stereotypes, but they do it under the guise of, this is an homage to these past films. This is an homage to genre. This is an homage to these tropes. And so under the cover of the homage, they can sneak in this appropriation. And I think that even if your intentions are earnest and sincere to say, no, this is an homage to these kinds of films. The buddies are running away and they're in the chain gang and they're in the South and, Cool Hand Luke and the Defiant Ones and this kind of stuff. But even if you're earnest, you have to be self-aware to go, what are the optics of what I'm doing? And it seems like the Coens, in my experience, they just ignore the optics and they're like, look, we're not appropriating anything. We're just making a film. If it has these aspects to it, then that's just part of the art. So I do feel a little bit uncomfortable with the Coens' appropriations under the guise of this kind of tribute or homage to these kinds of genre films. So I think that they don't get off the hook. It's a way to get off the hook that I think is a kind of a little bit of a wink wink. And I wish that they would say, we have no intention to appropriate, but neither do we want to give the impression. We want to be as cognizant as possible. Anyway, that was a little point that Peter brought up that I wanted to just kind of flesh out a little bit.
Can I follow up, Robert, without getting too much into the particular music, because we're going to talk about music later, but I feel the same way about the depiction of the rural Southerners, and there's a mention of Kentucky, of course, in the song. So maybe a kind of quick, connection to Appalachia. But this is mostly like Delta, Mississippi Delta type, communities, I imagine. On the one hand, it's full of all these stereotypes, and people, I know people who think that the Coen brothers mock, people too much, that they mocked Arizonans in Raising Arizona, they mocked Minnesotans in Fargo, and they're mocking, Southerners, white Southerners here. But I must say, when you began the podcast, I'm somebody who's, having lived now in Kentucky since 1998. I'm not from here. I'm from Philadelphia area, but I've grown sensitive. I've picked up that sensitivity of the stereotypical misrepresentation of mountain people and the derisive, contemptuous, attitudes that go with it. So I'm sort of primed to react to these stereotypical and derisive images contemptuously, but I do feel like there's almost like a loving quality to it that, for me, or a valorizing quality of, I don't know, maybe loving is too strong, but affectionate quality of in the music, because look, even in that, say, the baptism scene, and I think, Everett, gives the voice of the sort of northern secularists, a bunch of superstitious yokels, but the music is so beautiful, you can't deny it. I mean, sure, many people can't relate to that kind of religious, event, but the music is just absolutely lovely, and that goes throughout. I think something they might have picked up on, done a little bit more with, is if you go to the Stax Museum in Memphis, Stax Records Museum. And you'll see that like those early years, there was actually a lot, it wasn't just whites appropriating black music. There was a lot of cross-fertilization. A lot of early black musicians were listening to Tin Pan Alley music and Grand Ole Opry and getting influenced by that. And certainly some white musicians were appropriating black blues and country music too. But I think it was a more complicated musical scene than's often depicted, and I would have liked to have seen some more of that. But at any rate, it's strange. Against my inclinations, I found something charming. Part of it was, though, I'm a language guy, like you guys. I'm a professor. I just loved the way they played with the phrasings and the.
Yeah, and I'm very much in agreement with what you're saying here. That first of all, there is a poetry in this kind of language that they are picking up on and bringing out. And yes, they very often do that in a way that makes it humorous, and it can feel like mocking. And yet I think there's real beauty, not just in this case, but in all the cases, the Minnesota way of speaking and so on in Fargo. And like they're so aesthetically fascinating. And one of the things I love about the Coens is that they hear that and they're interested in that, when the impulse of so many other directors, and certainly big commercial directors, is flatten it out, make everybody sound the same. Because, we want this movie to play everywhere. We want it to appeal to everybody, so it can't be distinctive or idiosyncratic in any way. The Coens are the opposite. They care about the particular place that they're filming in. They care about the way people speak there. They care about the way people dress there, the ways they act that are different from how they act in different places. And they do exaggerate these things sometimes to the point of caricature, which can be weird.
Definitely.
Right? And it's hard to know how to take that. But I do feel, you said something like this, and this is something I've really come to feel about the Coens. And again, I want to be careful. I don't want to use this as like a blanket defense necessarily, but I do think that more often than not, when they're mocking somebody, it's because it's somebody they really care about in some way. And certainly their treatment of Jews and their, being themselves Jewish in their films attest to that. But I also think the treatment of Marge is a great example where clearly they love Marge as a character. They love her as a person. And they make her talk funny and they make her look funny sometimes. And we laugh at Marge, right? There's no question. She's kind of a goofy cartoon in some ways. But we love her and they love her. And that the mocking is sort of a way of expressing that in this very interesting way. The other thing I want to say, I want to go back to the baptism scene that you mentioned, because I think that for me, Ulysses or Everett's reaction in the baptism scene, or really the reaction of all three characters in a way, this gets at what may be the most interesting thing in this film for me, and what does sort of make it somewhat unique, at least to a degree, in their body of work, which is that you would think that they would fully take Everett's side, being the rationalist, secular folks that they are, right? Exactly. They should be on his side. They should be mocking too. What I feel in this film, and it does come across largely from the music, I think you're right, it's really rooted in that, is that they do identify with his ironic, skeptical take to a degree, and yet they also see the limits of it, and they regard him as being in a certain way impoverished for not being able to take part in this. So they're not going to say, I mean, they do on the level of plot. They do sort of say, well, there is a God because, there's a Deus Ex Machina at the end that saves our characters, right? It's again, like one of the only films set
His
in the
name is FDR.
Right, FDR, exactly.
Right.
I do love that, but that's so good. But, they're not going to endorse the existence of a supernatural God. And the only reason it looks like they do here is because, again, it's clearly a fairy tale. We're not meant to take it literally or seriously. It's like the Hudsucker Proxy when I said about that earlier, right? But I do think that they take religion seriously in this film in a way we don't usually see them doing. And that religion here is not for them an object of derision or anything of the sort, that they see a real value in it. And they see that, in a way, it's because we live in a world without God that we need religion so much, right? And that's not how people generally think about religion. They think, well, to have religion, that's about God. You need God, otherwise it doesn't make sense. And they get that. Again, the rational, secular part of them understands that critique. But they also see that in some way there's real value here and real beauty here that I rarely feel like, they're strongly appreciating. But in this film, they do. And I think that's very special. And it puts them in a very complicated place. They see why religion can't be true. These are people who, I'm stressing this point in almost every podcast we've done so far. They're nervous about narratives. They're nervous about the stories we tell because the stories we tell can be false and they can mislead people. Clearly, this applies to religious narratives as much as or more than any other narratives. They still have that anxiety. And yet here they are also wanting to say, there's real value in these narratives too, and I don't want to lose that. And after all, these are people who make narratives for a living, right? That's what they do. So I think that they're occupying a very complicated position here in this film.
I mean, I think you're right about religion. I might just expand it to say there's just a voluptuousness they tune into about cultures, period, whether it's religious culture or not. But certainly in this case, yeah, I think that's true about religion. Yeah. Part of this also, touches on the head and heart thing, because remember, Everett associates himself with abstract thought in the beginning when they challenge him as the leader. He says, well, I'm the one who's capable of abstract thought. The one that, maybe so, but what are then the others? Although, of course, that seems to be a little bit, when we encounter Dan Teague, he's not quite as savvy as he presents himself, but in other places. But at any rate, if he's abstract thought, then what about the others? And it takes us back to we're going to talk about the Wizard of Oz, I'm sure, and the troika there and how it relates to this one. But I think that there's a kind of moment of heart in the recognition here that he does seem a kind of, as you say, stunted or limited because of his position there, and he's not picking up on the voluptuous, heartful, beauty that's around him. It's in front of him, really. Everett, that is.
I don't know if this is pushback, but I had mentioned earlier the questioning where the Coen brothers come down on anti-intellectualism. And on the one hand, myself, coming from blue-collar background, first generation college, and thinking to valorize salt of the earth people and see the music and the culture and the life ways of Appalachians and blue collar, working class people in poverty, to see those values as being just as legitimate as the elite class. I acknowledge that. On the other hand, especially in the era of Trump, I want to resist this. And these two things kind of go together, right? It's like you can go to the point where you can valorize salt of the earth, acknowledge the important cultural and artistic aspects. And if you keep going along that spectrum, you'll hit anti-intellectualism, and you'll hit Donald Trump going, I love the uneducated, I love the people, right? So part of the fear is that the Ulysses character is supposed to be the skeptic, and he's supposed to be the one who's thinking rationally, and he talks about abstract thought, as you mentioned. How close are the Coens coming to Trump saying, I love the uneducated? They're great, right? Part of me wants to go, no, I want to stick with Ulysses. I think there are these kinds of explanations. I agree there's a voluptuousness to the whole culture. I'm not coming from an elitist point of view. I'm just questioning. This is a question of faith versus reason, right? This is an old question in philosophy and in culture, right? So you hit the point where you're like, faith is not about rationality anymore, right? It's like, even when we think about the theme of grace, right? Like, how do I get to heaven? You get to heaven through the grace of God. You don't get there through works or through intellect or studying the Torah. You get there through God's grace. And so there's this kind of blind faith that I think the film valorizes that makes me uncomfortable, that I want to go, wait, the Coens are like elite sophisticates who they're in the rarefied world of Manhattan, Upper West Side cocktail parties. And are they telling us are they valorizing dumbness? Because there's a lot of stupid people in this film. Yeah. And then I get nervous because I go back to Trump. Or are they giving us this meta wink, like, no, we realize that Ulysses is the guy, and it's a little wink, wink. I don't know. I just wanted to interject that, and maybe it's a little bit of a pushback. It made me uncomfortable to think, what the hell are they doing in this film? Are they just saying, you don't need to be skeptical, you don't need to use reason, you just throw your hallelujah, dip yourself in the River Jordan and everything will be fine? I know that they're not going that far.
I definitely don't think they're saying anything like that. And here's what I think they're saying.
But one could read. There are those who could read the film.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
And they allow it as a possible reading. They don't.
Yeah,
they're not definitive about Ulysses. We'll talk about when Ulysses starts praying, but I think that's an interesting scene. But please continue.
That is an interesting scene. I would say they are not clearly 100% on board with Ulysses. They do see him as having limitations, but the question of what those limitations are is very difficult and very, very complicated. here's what I think their overall sort of view here is, though I'm surely biased by the fact that it's very close to my view. And I have a feeling I want this to be their view, because it's what I think something like this is true, that we shouldn't valorize faith. Faith is simply dangerous. Ignorance is dangerous. These things are bad, right? And they can be easily manipulated and lead people to do awful things, and they have, and they are now, and so on. That's not what they want to valorize. But what they want to say is something like, there are true values in religion, for instance, that you can have even without the faith. Now, people have been convinced, or for one reason or another have come to think, that religion and faith have to go together. And in fact, in this culture, we think of religion and faith almost as being synonyms. That's what religion's all about. It's about having faith and believing in God, even though you don't have the evidence, blah, blah. I can't see them ever getting on board with that. But I do see here them trying to recognize something I haven't necessarily seen before in their works, which is that doesn't mean that every part of religion has to go down. And after all, if we look at the different major, Abrahamic religions, like Judaism, much more than Christianity, tends to say it's about community, it's about practice, it's about various things that we do. Maybe there's a God, maybe that's who we're praying to when we pray, but maybe there's no God. How could you know, right? There's many more Jews that are willing to say that, certainly in the United States again, than there are American Christians who are willing to say such a thing. And so I think that they're trying, but it's a very sort of subtle position, and that's why it's hard to say exactly what they're saying, or even exactly what's wrong with somebody like Everett. That it's not that he lacks faith, but that his rejection of religion is so powerful that he can't even find a beauty and a pleasure in something like the baptism ceremony, whether he's going to get in the water himself or not, right? And he doesn't have to go that far, partly. Maybe that is sort of silly. I don't know, but maybe there's a kind of meaning to be had in that too. Who knows? But the fact that he can't see anything of value in it, and that he always ends up being the sort of detached outsider who is simply critical, is robbing him of certain potential sources for meaning and solace in a very difficult world.
Yeah, so there's two things I wanted to say. First, to amplify what you were saying, Robert, I agree, is like, remember in American Fiction, that recent film, there's a great moment. I mean, I think this addresses that issue, head on, but there's that great moment where you see, the Issa, what's her name, character, reading from her book that's full of sort of urban street jargon, even though she seems very like highly educated and upper class, spoken kind of person, and who jumps to her feet is like this clearly like white liberal woman who just finds this like, hooray, you're just, you've captured the essence of the black street life, and you're just like, oh my God, this is just the kind of bullshit imaginary that they inhabit. On the other hand, there's a way that the Coens are alive to the kind of complication that Troy points out, in the sense that there's just a structural thing. So the first time the trio encounters people in white gowns in the forest is when they encounter the baptism. The second time they encounter people in white gowns in the forest is at night for the Klan rally. And so I think structurally they're making this connection. There's a light side to it and there's a dark side to it. And these gowned people who are getting baptized here, they have other gowns too, which you'll see in their dark side. And so I felt like that was a kind of, way of structurally signaling the consciousness of both, in a way. The beautiful, voluptuous quality of that culture and the sinister, violent, dark, quality of that culture too.
That's a great observation, Peter. I think you're right about that. That's really good. And, the Coens are doing this partly because they are very aware of their own tendency to be skeptical and reject such things. They know that's where they are and who they are. And they're trying, I think, in a certain way to be self-critical of that and say, that too can be taken potentially too far.
Well, I'm going to stand my ground. I'll say that I appreciate what you articulated. It was very eloquent, and I was almost drawn in to follow you there. But I do want to say that
you started thinking.
I started thinking, you're being as charitable, super charitable as one could be with what the Coen brothers are doing, and I think maybe I'm being a little more cynical. This thing that, like, this reputation that the Coen brothers are like, they mock everyone and stuff, but two things. That only gets you so far. You can only take that so far, and then you have to sort of own it. And I think this is what I was saying earlier. I think the Coen brothers have a tendency to slip out using, well, we're just mocking, or we're not, we're these are homage to tropes and stuff. So I think that's one aspect that I sort of feel a little uncomfortable. The second thing is, you mentioned, Troy, that, when they mock people, it's a gesture of love and stuff. But I don't see the Coen brothers loving Asians in their films. I mean, it's hard for me to watch A Serious Man, that in particular, and go like, oh no, they just love Asians. That's why. So I think that defense only goes so far. And then you have to say, either they're not being conscious of it. They're, again, using this thing like, that's just from a movie from the 60s. That's really what we're doing. This is that kind of thing. Or they're not cognizant of the optics, which would make them ignorant. Or they're just using their mockery, snarkiness to slip away and go like, we're the Coen brothers, and then we don't have to answer these questions. So anyway, I don't know, why am I being so harsh on the Coen brothers today? I don't know why.
No, I think it's fair. It's fair.
I love the Coen brothers, but we haven't even gotten through all this discussion, which has been really fruitful and I think fascinating. But we haven't even asked Troy about his political, social, cultural themes, and I think maybe do we want to move to that?
We probably should, but I mean, we've touched on a lot of what I would have brought up, and so maybe one thing that we've touched on this too, but one thing I'd like to get into a little more deeply is I do really find myself struck by what a deep theme salvation is in this film. The word is used several times. For instance, when they're again in with Stephen Root in the recording studio, he introduces, Soggy Bottom Boys. He seems to make up that name out of nowhere, and then he says, "Songs of salvation to salve the soul." Right? That just sort of pops out of, and I know the word is used at least once before that in the film somewhere too, and then it comes up again after.
Troy, very quickly, I thought Soggy Bottom Boys was a reference to their jumping into the river.
I think that's right, or at least partly, yeah. I think that's right. That's where it comes from. Yeah, the baptism scene has just happened quite recently.
Yeah.
And because of that as well, I think the concept of salvation is kind of on his mind, and I think that as a sort of cunning, manipulative Odysseus type figure, that he's kind of pulling that out as something that's liable to appeal to large audiences, right? So we want this guy to give us money to sing a song. What is it about? It's about salvation, right? We can sell that to everybody. He, in that moment, is sort of the Bible salesman himself, who they're going to, meet a little later on, selling religion for money. But so much of this film is about salvation and what it is and how you get it. And, there is, of course, the amusing misapprehension on Delmar's part, and maybe Pete too, but certainly Delmar, that when he gets his sins washed away in the river, that's going to count legally, that they can't throw him in prison now. Because what he says, I'll quote from him here, the preacher said, "All my sins is washed away, including that Piggly Wiggly I knocked over in Yazoo. Neither God nor man's got nothing on me now," he says. Like, that's so great that somebody would think this way. It's wonderfully innocent. And it is getting at what I think is a very interesting question that this film is raising about different levels of authority, and about, for instance, how if you are a religious believer or even take that seriously or whatever, how does the worldly law, the law of humans, the legal institutions that we create, relate to the supernatural realm, God's law, right? What are the relations there? Can you be saved in terms of one but not the other? Which one takes priority if there's a conflict, and so on? And then, of course, for some of us, there's a third level, which would be, because again, I don't believe in God. I'm no supernaturalist, but I am a moral realist of a sort. And so I think that there are actually real values in the world of an objective sort. They're not supernatural. That's a misunderstanding. But they're real. They're objective. It's not just something that we make up, right? So in addition to the legal systems, which are the creation of human beings, there's also real values in the world. Well, so how do those relate to, right? Where do those come from? And so one of the obvious places that this is sort of spoken in some way is at the end, when Cooley and his men are about to hang all of them. And Everett appeals to the law, said, "This isn't right. We've been pardoned," right? That's the law. And he says back, of course, Cooley says the law is a human institution, right? Suggesting that in some way Cooley's not human, whether that means that he's supernatural, which is at least hinted at in some ways. And I think the film plays with it because, again, Wizard of Oz, he could be a witch type thing, essentially. But it also just could mean he's inhuman in the sense of, having no conscience and not caring. I'm a sociopath, essentially. Human institutions, we all know those were made up. They're not real. There's nothing to them. So why should I be bound by them? We're out here in the middle of the woods. There's nobody around. Where's your human institution now? Out here in the woods, it's Hobbes, right? It's, the strong do what they can get away with, and the weak suffer what they must. So it's hard to tell exactly what he's saying, right? We don't know him well enough to know. There's these different interpretations there.
And Troy, just to jump in for Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher.
That's right. I should.
Who famously said life is nasty, brutish, and short in a state of nature. And
yeah, which can be true. I've times in my life, sure, but Thomas Hobbes. That's right. We should identify the philosopher. They're going to think we're talking about some other podcaster or something. So Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher. This thing runs through the film, and because I think that so much of the film, is these guys who have these sort of marks on their character and these marks on their legal record, who are trying to figure out what to do about this. They want to go rejoin society, but it's not going to be easy because of their past, right? So what do you do, with the difficult past? And this, in a way, that's the secular version of the question of salvation. How do I redeem myself? How do I save my soul? How do I get clean again and get pure again and go back to that state of innocence, which at least legally we have, even if religiously we don't, because, if we follow Christian views, there's original sin, so we never really have that state of innocence. The only way to become, to get that is through God's grace, right? Well, God's grace is a complicated concept. We get a lot of stories about that, even if we confine ourselves just to Christianity, which is the dominant religion in this movie. There's a lot of different stories about exactly how that works. But of course, according to a lot of people, if it's grace, it has to be freely given, meaning you can't earn it, right? It's got nothing to do with anything that you do. But of course, in America, the idea of God's grace has become wrapped up with ideas of material success. And so, because of this Calvinist influence and so on, right, we have this very, very influential idea, comes through people like Ben Franklin, comes through all sorts of early important American thinkers in one way or another, that if you're one of God's elect and you're going to go to heaven because you've got grace and so on, probably since God loves you, you're also going to do well in this earthly realm. And so wealthy people are more likely to get into heaven. And so we end up with this very weird but massively influential sort of social view of a kind of hierarchy where people who get rich and do well in the capitalist system are to be admired, not only for their capitalist abilities, but as virtuous people. They must be good people. We should all look up to them. They're actually more holy than the rest of us. That I think has been hugely influential in explaining why capitalism takes the form that it has here and has been as successful as it has here. And I think this movie's doing a lot with that. If we look at the progress of these characters and so on. Now, how is it again that in the end they end up okay and they end up on the right side of the law? Well, because they make a lot of money and they get a lot of success through this song that they record. They become stars. And even that isn't intentional, right? It's not their plan. They get a treasure, but not the treasure that they're seeking, as the blind seer says at the beginning, right? The Tiresias figure. The treasure that they get is one they weren't even aiming at. They thought, well, they got paid $10 each for this song. That was the end of it. They had no idea something more would come of it. So, and it could very easily have happened that nothing more did come of it. It was in large part, and I'm not saying it's not a good song, it's a very good song, but still, anytime something like this happens, there's a lot of luck involved. It's luck that they even recorded the thing. It's luck that they met Tommy Johnson when they did, It's luck that people listened to this thing and it became huge. So we have this other case, we saw this in Hudsucker Proxy, and we're going to see it in some of their films later on, of luck determining a person's success rather than, something like effort or an actual plan. Miguel always claims to have plans, but his plans rarely go the way they're supposed to, right? This wasn't his plan at all. But it works out that they all become rich, successful, happy and so on, are able to reintegrate, to use that word, into society. And of course, this becomes it is in this film, sort of the earthly equivalent of the religious notion of salvation. So I think there's very interesting stuff going on in this film about American religion and how it's wrapped up with our thoughts and feelings about capitalism and about success, what it is to have a good life, what it is to be redeemed, essentially, and who it is we're supposed to look up to and admire, right? Stuff like that. And it's bound up with, among other things, that theme that has come up so many times, and I think probably in every Coen film in some way, which is, again, luck and chance and the influence of chance in human affairs.
On that point, one thing I noticed, it's after the baptism when they meet Tommy at the crossroads, right? Delmar, he's sort of on this high, right? He's like, everything's groovy. It seems that Delmar is the one that is suggesting that, hey, who's that guy on the, they pick him up. So one could argue that it's not really chance, it's that God's grace. Once he's baptized, he transcends race. Because realistically, even if you're open-minded in 1937 or whatever, 3 white guys are going to pick up a black guy standing in the corner at the crossroads in Mississippi. So there is some suggestion that it's through God's grace that they transcend their bigotry or their sort of institutionally produced racism. So that's one way to remove chance and say it's God. See what God does? The scales fell from his eyes after he got out of the river and he saw that all men were created equal. I thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because again, this movie, like I say, is one of the very few Coen films that takes place in a just universe. And so it's certainly open to that sort of reading. Look, everything that happens that eventually leads to them being saved. The flood is the most obvious example, though that too, of course, has, a naturalistic explanation, but so does everything potentially. And if we're Everett, we'll take that. But in some cases, the more natural explanation seems to be, or some people will say that, God planned it and he made it happen that way. He took this guy, Tommy Johnson, who had just sold his soul to the devil. But nonetheless, he makes him the instrument of God's grace and he helps redeem these people and he's going to get redeemed himself. And all this works because it's part of God's plan. And that's certainly a way to read. But again, I think partly, and this is very much like my reading of the Hudsucker Proxy, that it's because they feel like they can do that in this film. They want to do it because they, again, want to take religious stories and so on seriously and ask what kind of, meaning we can find them, etc. But they also allow themselves to do it because the story itself, the whole film, is presented as a kind of a fable or fairy tale that we can't really take seriously. So it's constantly, in one sense, undermining itself. It's giving us a version of those stories. And yet there's no point at which we can, no reasonable person could point to this and say, this is what life is like. Look, God plans everything. Well, clearly this isn't what life is like. And you're in many ways, including, as you say, in 1937, would these 3 white guys have picked up this black guy at the corner? No, they wouldn't have, right? That wouldn't even happen. So in a great many ways, this is obviously overtly a fairy tale. And so they're allowing themselves to tell stories like this. And yet at the same time, I find even here, to me, this also reads as a story of chance where, in fact, I don't really think it here. I'm with Everett now, right? I don't think it's God that planned it. I don't think he did the flood. I don't think he put Tommy there. I think all this is just luck. And there were equally morally good, morally bad people out there. There were equally talented musicians out there at the very same time. They never went anywhere. Right? Nothing good ever happened for them. Why? Bad luck. They didn't get the breaks. They're not the ones who get movies made about them. So we never hear about them, right? And so we get this idea that, things work out the way they should because the good prosper. But there's plenty of people, just as good out there who have had bad luck and they haven't prospered at all.
But Troy, how does that jibe with your claim that this is a just universe? It's a just universe, and yet it's blind luck that leads people to salvation or damnation. So
yeah,
there's some tension there.
Yeah. No, well, it's the Coen brothers. I think they want it both ways. I think they want to have both at the same time. So it's a just film in the sense that all the good people, assuming we take them to be good. And there's questions about that, right? There's room to push back and say, are these guys really that good? Do they even deserve it, right? But let's not get into that, at least in the moment. Let's take it the main characters and so on are good. They end up happy, I'm assuming. They end up, getting essentially what they want, more or less, in one form or another by the end of the film. And the forces of evil that were pursuing them and so on are defeated. So, in that way, it's a just universe, clearly more so than No Country for Old Men, clearly no more so than A Serious Man, even more so than Fargo, where, again, the bad people, bad things happen to them, but a bunch of innocent people get killed along the way. That doesn't even happen here, right? It's a universe, judging by this particular movie and the people in the movie, where everybody seems to get what they deserve. So we can say on that surface level, at least of plot, it's a just world. And then there's the further question of, well, what are the mechanisms that bring that about? Is it because God plans it? or something like that. And that's where I sort of want to say, well, what the Coen brothers want us to say is, no, it's because the screenwriters planned it. It's a story. They made it up. And so they decided that's what would happen. And that's why this is a just universe. And generally in stories that look like they're just, that's why. Because the people telling the story decided to tell it that way, or to tell that particular story and not some other one.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to just sort of amplify some of that by saying, I'm sort of interested in the Greek goddess Tuke, who becomes Fortuna for the Latins. And by the way, there's an unusual amount of Latin in this movie. I don't know why. There's the Pater Familias, there's the Bona Fide, there's the Amor Fidelis. I mean, whatever. That doesn't matter. But
are we talking Machiavellian Fortuna?
Yeah, that's right. The wheel goes up, the wheel goes down, and so because the wheel can go up and down, there is like this, Fortuna is sort of with chance and kind of cruel chance a lot of times, but also there's like an idea of it's not too far connected from fate too. Like your fate is to be subject to chance in a way, and I think they funnel it through some religion and some of the symbolic qualities of film. I was thinking about how the crucifix literally, offs Dan Teague, and the flood offs Sheriff Cooley, and so they're taking these two instruments of religious symbolism, Old Testament and New Testament, to purge evil. I just wanted to amplify what you're saying with that. Yeah. Oh, I did want to ask you, so what do you think the upshot though is of the ending? Is it seems like it's valorizing on one level, like they get the money, they're going to be rich from their record. His wife is coming back. We don't exactly know what happens to the other two, but I think there's just this moment. They love to throw in. We were talking about in Raising Arizona, the fact that it's a dream when the family is kind of projected into the future there, and so therefore called into question to some extent. And here, it's just that they're actually ending up. The ending is bickering, and she seems to be demanding of him an impossible task, a Hercules-like task to find that ring at the bottom of the 9,000 hectare, I was curious that he said hectare too. I'm like, really? Okay. Lake. So does that suggest maybe that their marriage isn't going to be as successful as, we would typically hope, and maybe even about the money? I don't know what to say about the money, but they do seem to be in the money at the end, and in the power too. Maybe they might find that once they're in that world of machine politics, that things aren't going to be as rosy as they think. Because we've seen how that guy O'Down treats his subordinates, and now they're part of it. So,
yeah, working with him is not going to be a picnic, or it's going to be a picnic of the Dan Tig type, which is not really the big Dan, not fun picnic.
Yeah, right.
But and I think that being married to Penny also may not be. And I like this twist on, Penny, of course, is named after Penelope from the Odyssey, but
Right.
Penelope seems to be an extremely, virtuous and good wife to Ulysses, whereas in this case, there's a nice irony.
Right. She doesn't wait.
well, no, let's not talk. Not get into that. Yeah, no, this Penny, right? No, she doesn't wait. She's ready to marry somebody else. Oh, right, yes, yeah. She's got only one suitor, but it's enough, and she's going to marry this guy. Lies about what happened to Ulysses, and so and turns out to be pretty opportunistic herself. And just is, I think you're right. There's hints she's going to be very difficult. But I think this goes back to Raising Arizona, and it's something I very briefly mentioned, I think, in the lightning round, that in Raising Arizona, there's these interesting questions about family versus prison, right? Which one is more restrictive? There's a lot of there's the wonderful moment again, right, where the guy says, look, we'll pull this off, or we'll get caught and, get sent back to prison. And either way, you're set for life. Right. It's just different ways of being from a certain mindset. And I think there's some of that going on here, too. The fact, again, that the first image we see is the prisoners chained together in the chain gang. And the last image we see is the girls and the family all being strung together. Right. Family life is a kind of prison life. So I think, I think there's this nice suggestion of a sort of an irony that Ulysses begins the film by escaping from one prison and ends up locking himself up in a different kind of prison. And so, his plan, even when he achieves his plans, it doesn't work out the way he thinks it's going to.
I was thinking that maybe it also even says, like, the Deus Ex Machina isn't enough. Like, what the hell? I got the ring.
Right.
God brought the flood. He gave me the freaking roll top thing, and that's not enough for you.
Right.
It's like,
And that is a nice point that casts some doubt on the idea of the flood being a miracle or something, because it does look like a miracle that not only do they survive the flood and it comes at the right time and stuff, but they find the roll top desk because that's what Tommy's clinging to. But then it turns out that's not where the ring is. So it doesn't work out.
The read that at the end he's back in some kind of prison in his marriage, I think that's interesting. I didn't read it like that. What I read it is that the storybook version of this tale is that he goes back and everyone lives happily ever after with the family, but not for the Coen brothers. What happens is he's back to his normal life, right? So his normal life is he has a demanding wife. She has these kids she has to take care of. You can read her as being opportunistic by having another suitor, or you could read her as, I got all these kids. I got a baby in my arms, right? Realistically, I need someone who's bona fide. I need somebody to take care of me. This is the truth. She wasn't going to go out and start a career, right, in 1937 in the South. So she's doing what she could do as a woman taking care of her family. Maybe that's opportunistic. But what I see the Coens as saying is, you know what? At the end of the film, he's back in his regular life. Let me go back to It's a Wonderful Life. At the end of the film, all the little things that annoyed him, the knob that falls off the railing and all the family that he was freaking out, it's like, I'm just glad to be back in my normal life. And I think after this epic that Ulysses goes on and all this trials and tribulations, he's back there and his wife's saying, no, that's not the right ring. And he's got the kids on the line and he's just walking down the street. Now, I'm not reading that as he's happy, where he's like, oh, this is perfect. It's not a fairy tale in that sense. It's Coen brothers. But I didn't read it as he's back in prison because he's married. I read it as this is his life. This is his normal life. And the normal life is better than the life that he just left out running away from dogs and being in prison and breaking stones. So anyway, that's how I read that. And I have another quick theory that I have no evidence for, but it just popped into my head, and that is Raising Arizona's Edwina is Penny's granddaughter. Now I gotta go find evidence for that after the podcast, but it's Holly Hunter. Come on.
It's a great theory. It's a great theory. I love it. That's at least as plausible as the theory that the toad is Pete, I got to tell you. So yeah, a quick response, because I actually agree with most of what you're saying here, and I think my comment probably sounded harsher than I meant it to. I'm not convinced that they're saying that Everett's going to be deeply unhappy or something like that, or it's a prison in that sense. I think that the imagery clearly suggests on some level some sort of equivalence or some sort of a metaphorical relation. And so they're not necessarily saying, oh, marriage is terrible because it's a prison, or even this marriage is terrible or something like that. I do think Penny's difficult in some ways. But I think it's more, they could just as well be saying prison's not what we think it is. Right. It's just another way of being. Like wherever we are, whatever kind of life we're living, even if you take two that we sort of think of as diametrically opposed, like being in prison or just having a normal family life, so opposed that one would try to escape from the one at great risk, in order to get to the other. They're still different ways of reality being structured around you. And so one, for instance, one implication of this might be we think of prisoners, people in prison and so on, as being completely different from the rest of us because they're set apart, right? And that's not life, but it is life. It's life for them. And they're just human beings too, like the rest of us, right? So I think there are interesting metaphorical resonances going on here that concern the question of freedom and what we mean by freedom and what it is to be free. We can imagine a very naive way, well, if you're in prison, you're not free. But if you break out, and then you'll be free. Well, you're free in some ways, but you still have to live. You still have to meet your needs. You're still going to have relationships. You're still going to have obligations. There's still places you can go and places you can't go, right? There's all sorts of things that are true of your life. Freedom is a very empty word until we start to really think about what it involves, what it means. And so I think on that level, at least, they are suggesting, equivalence may be too strong a word, but it's interesting to think about in what sense is now Everett is free at the end and in what senses he might not be free. And then I would add to that, I think the one last thing I would add is that I'm thinking here, we've mentioned The Wizard of Oz. I'm thinking again about the end of The Wizard of Oz, and this maybe does support a reading of things being at least more complicated than the clear, happy ending story that we might be tempted to give it, that at the Wizard of Oz, it's tempting to say Dorothy got what she wanted. She made it home, and so everything's going to be groovy and she's going to be happy. But let's remember that that's a very difficult home for her. She was dying to get out of that place at the beginning of the film. All the same people are still there, right? What's changed? I mean, probably this was all just a dream that she had. So now maybe her journey has changed her, and maybe now things are going to be different because of that. That's a suggestion that we can certainly read into the film. But it's also just as possible that, Salman Rushdie has a really nice little short book on Wizard of Oz in the BFI series. And one of the things he says in that book is the one part of Wizard of Oz that he never bought is the idea that Dorothy would want to leave Oz and go back home, because home was black and white and miserable and she hated everything about it. And Oz is amazing. I mean, it's scary, but it's colorful and exciting and it's incredible. Who would want to leave there to go back to Kansas? And I can see that to a degree, So yeah, she goes back home and she gets what allegedly she wanted, but at what point is she going to wake up and say, damn it, I should have stayed in Oz? That was really a lot more interesting than this. This place is really dreary and kind of awful.
This touches back on the George Bailey phenomenon,
Yes.
which is,
Yes.
What George Bailey learns is that he actually did have a, quote, wonderful life, or that things weren't so bad. And so maybe...
I mean, that's the official reading of the movie, and I grant that it's there, but...
Troy and I discussed this on our radio program. We can put a link to it in the program notes. We had a hell of a time with It's a Wonderful Life. But what I'm getting at is, to give pushback to Salman Rushdie, is that, and I'll speak for myself, my own personal experience as I get older. There was a time when I did want to go to Vegas and go party and go to Hollywood, and I could see at some point going, as colorful and as glamorous and glitzy as Oz is, I just want to hang out with my family in Kansas. Now, I know that's contra Delfino.
I was just going to bring
how do you get him back on? Can't put him back on the phone.
Right.
Bunny isn't itching to go back home.
Bunny isn't. But my point is that there's a read in which Everett is, he's back in his life, and again, he has this transformation where he's like, hey, this wasn't that bad to begin with compared to what the hell I've been through. So anyway.
Yeah. No, I'll give you that. I'll absolutely give you that. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say that there's a strange kind of circularity in the film. I mean, you pointed to something, Troy, with like the chains and all that, and I think that's true. But like for a road movie, like they keep on ending up like going past the chain gang over and over. Like they're back to the chain gang, and they don't seem to like be covering much miles. I mean, there's that part when they're in the car, but somehow they seem to be coming back, and presumably he knows where his family is, or like he finds his family when we're close to the end. So there's some weird circularities in the film, even though it seems like it should be linear in the way going from the chain gang to the finding the treasure.
Well, in the Odyssey, it takes Ulysses like 10 years to get back to Ithaca.
Right.
So I mean, the whole voyage is circular, of course, and circularity. The Coens love circularities, right? And they love circles. We've seen this before, and there's a fair number of circles in this film too.
The film ends with the Oracle back on the train track.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't believe they don't help him when they get on the thing in the first place. Maybe that's a moment of
They're such
racism
jerks.
too. It's like they climb on and they let him, this old guy, keep on.
I did think about that. I was like, why are they having him push them? I was thinking that another read on the chain gang, the three guys are chained together, the kids are chained together. One of the themes I brought to the table is saying that the film is about interconnectedness and interdependency. And this is a film that takes place in the Depression in the South, and how much we depend on each other. This myth of the American rugged individualism is just that, a myth. One way to read the chain and the little girls connected is that it's a physical manifestation of the fact that we are all interconnected in these ways that we ignore, and in these ways that the myth of individualism occludes to us. We're self-made, Horatio Alger, when in fact what the film is saying is these three guys, and it's literal, right? They are dependent on each other, right? He can't even jump on the train unless all three of them jump on the train, right? And I love that scene. I love that scene when he goes, "Well, I vote for me," and then Everett says, "I vote for me," and Delmar says, "I'm with you guys."
Fellas.
I'm with you guys. That was great.
That's a great line.
It's a great scene. Yeah.
But anyway, so I was thinking of the chains and the connectedness of the girls as a kind of literal manifestation of this notion throughout the film. Is think about, and Troy, this goes to something that you said actually, which is think about it is chance. But think about the fate as the journey unfolds, how much it depends on others. Like they meet the soothsayer and they catch a ride, or they meet Babyface Nelson and they see his thing and they get some money and they catch. So, and the notion of what I was talking about earlier was the notion of family. So I wanted to connect this kind of care ethics notion of like, the care ethicists are famous for saying we're so interconnected. It's, especially in the culture, we're blinded to this when we stop and think about it. And I think politically, remember when Obama had the audacity to say, those self-made millionaires, well, the system, they set up the highways and they set up the roads, and he got lambasted by the right because God forbid that he would question, self-made. So I kind of see the chains as one way to read them is to say, hey, we're all connected. We're connected in these ways. And as we learn throughout the film, these people are dependent on each other, and family, the importance of family. Now, of course, Pete's cousin turns them in. It's like family can be a two-sided coin.
Well, family's one thing, Robert, but kin is something else. You can't trust your kin.
Kin is something else.
That's right.
But this circles back to the other question I started with, which is the question that the Coens ask: what is a man? What is a man, Mr. Lebowski? And the question of manhood and the question of masculinity, runs throughout this entire film, right? And Everett is obsessed with, I have to come back. I have to be the father. These are my kids, paterfamilias. I have to do this thing. And then the suitor, he challenges the suitor, and it's in this kind of classic. They have the fist fight. The father of husband's going to come back, and what this all connects to for me is this question of family unity and the sort of affirmation of family and relationships. But going to I just want to bring in one more thing I was thinking about when I was saying that was the issue of disenfranchised folk. Here we are in the Depression. People are dirt poor. They're disenfranchised, right? They're politically, they're financially, culturally disenfranchised. And what they have in common, right, is they're victims of capitalism. And so if you think about it, the sirens, they turn Pete in. The kin, his cousin, turns them in. And you can read that as being, well, they're not virtuous people, but you can also read that as a symptom of the system who put disenfranchised people in a position to where they have to choose between fidelity to their family or to eat, right? And so the incentive to have a reward to turn in the three fugitives, I think that represents this kind of look at what the system has done to them such that they're selling out their cousins. And so I think that's a manifestation it's a symptom of not only the Depression, but this kind of banding together under oppression, banding together, but also being forced to make these kinds of decisions, because the system has failed. And so I think I'm tying this all back to like interdependence.
Yeah. Well, there's that great moment when Pete is confronting his cousin. Yeah, Pete's up there in the barn. The cops are surrounded them. And what the cousin says is, I'm sorry, but they got this depression going on here, and I got to look out for my own. And so it's exactly what you're talking about.
Well, I mean, it's like the failures of capitalism. They put pressure upon the have-nots, and they have to choose between betraying their values and their family or surviving or eating. So anyway, that was.
And then those pressures are tied up with the ideology that people absorb. So there's this great tension running through the film where I think you're right to read the chains in this way. It's one of the things they symbolize, the fact that these three guys who are such good friends are literally chained together at the beginning. But of course, one of the first things they want to do is break the chains and get free, which on a practical level, obviously, is what anybody would want. It makes sense. It's not a crazy thing to want. But metaphorically, it's great, right? Like they're going to spend the whole film together. The only time they get separated is when Pete is separated for a while. And what they want more than anything is to get back together. They're so close. They're tied up together. They're literally chained together emotionally and in care and so on, as you say. And yet they got to break those chains because, again, for practical reasons, but also society has told them that. They had that little election, like you said, well, who gets to be the leader? And everybody votes for themselves, essentially. I'm for yours truly. Well, I'm for yours truly, too, right? I think, and this may be reading too much into it, I'm sure some people would say, but I find it very interesting. This is yet again from the recording studio scene with Stephen Root. That they have trouble saying the word accompanist. It's not a hard word to say, but what does that word represent? What does it mean? You're accompanying somebody, you're together, right? They stumble on that word. He's our accompanied. Now, of course, the accompanist in this case is black, so maybe that's part of the resistance too. It's hard to admit, even for these guys who mostly seem to be race blind, it's hard to admit on some level that you're accompanied by a black person. And then can I mention one more while I'm listing them off? And then that's just, there's a beautiful scene. I love this scene so much when they're around the campfire. They're talking about their dreams and their goals and what they're going to do with the money when Pete and Delmar still believe that there's money. And Delmar talks about buying back the family farm. And he expresses his answer to the question, what makes a man, right? You remember this? He says, you ain't no kind of man if you ain't got land. So he's internalized that sort of ideology of the property, right? You're not really a man unless you own property, which I think, and this goes back, Robert, your thing about disenfranchisement, and it's a very interesting thing to say in a movie about three people who spend almost the whole thing outdoors, who going from one house to the next, one car to the next, right? Who live essentially as if they've got nothing, and who are in a society where there's a whole bunch of people roaming the landscape who are in that condition.
Well, that's what I'd make to a connection. I mean, I think you're right about that, but there's of course like Jode, like images that they create from Grapes of Wrath. But if you notice, like their adversaries again, it's like there's the government, of course, there's who has imprisoned them, but also when they encounter the cousins, their nephew. He says, I grazed the census guy, and I'm also trying to. Pa told me to shoot whoever's trying to come and serve papers. I mean, there's an anti-government thing there going, recognizing that the government is not their friends, and the banks. And so that thing about the, the property, it's right. He recognizes property, but also he wants to get back at the banks who have just taken his land from him. So there's the state, there's the banks, there's other people, but what prevails is their friendship, It seems like it's going to fall apart. It is amazing to me. It doesn't fall apart after the revelation that, Everett has lied to them, and that they're facing 50 more years.
Fortunately, they're distracted by the Klan. If it hadn't been for that,
that adversary causes them to join together and to, save their fourth guy. Mm-hmm. So, philia seems to be really like a very positive virtue here, as it was in The Big Lebowski, and maybe even more so because the connection to family and Storga, that's family love. I think you make a strong case, Robert. It seems sometimes like a little, not dark enough for the Coens, but like, okay.
Yeah, no, you're right. And in this, both in this case and The Big Lebowski, if you think about this state, I mean, the state is mostly just absent in The Big Lebowski, but we see a few representatives, mostly cops, people like that. And most of them are corrupt or unhelpful or uninterested. Same here. I mean, all the cops in this movie are essentially the enemy. There's no good cop that we see. There's nobody like that. So I've said, and I keep saying this film is set in a just universe, and in some sense that's certainly true. But on the level of earthly authority, it's not just at all. The whole justice system, the whole state, the banks, as you say, all of them are these corrupt institutions that are just out to get everybody. And the politicians, of course, who we see who are just jockeying for power, and the right choice in the end is to choose the lesser of two evils, but they both seem pretty corrupt when it comes down to it. So the only virtue that we see here is in private life, friendship, family, whatever it is. And then maybe, we can understand why people like this would aspire to some sort of religion or something like that and think, well, there's this supernatural authority somewhere else that is good and will take care of us and we can trust, because they sure aren't seeing any good, benevolent, reliable authority here on earth.
But the Deus ex machina is the state. The state provides them with salvation.
That's true,
That's right.
if they can see
That's
it.
why I was saying it's sort of an allusion to what's going to come in, the 60s and 70s, at least by some readings, that where the federal government the intervention was really what improves things. Which is not exactly true, but it is a common narrative.
Last thing I wanted to say quickly and move into our philosophical themes is I read an essay by this guy Jeffrey Adams, who wrote on this film, and he made a good point about the connection in the film between the railroads and being a symbol of manifest destiny, the sort of opening of the West, But he pointed out how the railroads, this great symbol of promise and of progress, became associated instead with poverty and homelessness, right? The hobo, the Great Depression, riding the rails, But what do you say we move into our philosophical themes? I think we covered actually a number of philosophical themes, and I personally don't have much of a deep bench in my notes on philosophical themes. But who wants to throw the first?
Cast the first stone.
Cast the first. Yeah. What the hell kind of metaphor am I looking for?
I think that as far as the skepticism goes, Everett keeps on saying, he talks about people wanting to find the answers, but then he says about himself at a certain point, I've got the answers. And there's this question about whether he's got a kind of presumption. And, because look, I mean, certainly his colleagues, his friends don't know Everett. They don't know who Dan Teague is. And Dan, I mean, it was just a bizarre scene where like Everett's just sitting there going like, what's going on, Dan? After he just clobbers Delmar, It shows how he really is kind of daft sometimes.
I think he's a trusting soul in a way. I think, look, they've all got their limitations, and I think that Everett, as knowing as he is in certain ways, he is naive in the sense that he sort of can't imagine that this person who seems intelligent and well-spoken and so much like him could actually be a bad person. And so he turns out in that case to be very slow on the uptake. I mean, comically so. Again, it's played as a cartoon, right? Nobody would literally take that long. But yeah, it's one of those places, I think, where we see where he does run up against a certain cognitive limit. He just literally can't take in what's going on.
Troy, you have any philosophical themes you want to bring up on this one?
Well, Peter, you didn't bring up nihilism, but you're saving that for Coen Brothers themes? Is that...
I had that written in my notes. Here's what I have, nihilism ?
Nihilism?
That's
I was saving that. Yeah, I was saving that.
We can save... We often on this podcast have difficulty distinguishing Coen Brothers themes from philosophical themes because they are so philosophical, and so which one... So we can save that for Coen Brothers themes. That's fine, but I do want to make sure we talk about it. I don't know. I think in that case, then, if we're saving that one, most of what I've got, otherwise we've already touched on in the last segment. So, I don't know if I have anything new at this point.
I guess the only thing I wanted to raise, which is, what are the Coens saying about reason? Is the answer that we've talked about already, which is reason is good up to a point, but then you have to, or if reason may blind you. So there's a sense in which reason opens your eyes, and in this Platonic way, it's hard to see the sun when you come out of the cave, but then you finally can see clearly. It seems like the Coens want to say, and reason can also blind you to this other part of the world that, Peter, you were calling voluptuous, beautiful, or the aesthetic. I was thinking about the limits, if any, of reason, what the Coen brothers might be saying about that, but.
Maybe it's a certain conception of reason that they think can be blinding. I don't know if they want to impugn all reason in that way. I don't know. I mean, Peter might be more sympathetic to that view as a Humean, that, reason is very limited and so on, but we need other stuff. But I would tend more to think that, there's ways of being reasonable or thinking that you're going by reason that are actually quite limiting, and so you miss stuff. But I mean, Everett's a hard guy to figure out because he does slip into these other, endorsing paranormal phenomena at that moment. Or there's a moment, it's in the restaurant where he's there with Delmar and the Toad where they meet Big Dan. And God, how does it go? Delmar says something like, I feel like, because they're keeping the Toad concealed, and Delmar thinks it's Pete, and he says, I feel like we're judging him. And Everett says something really surprising. He says something like, well, I am ashamed of him. We are judging him because, he got himself into this. And he starts using religious imagery and vocabulary. He says, he got himself into this by fornicating with whores of Babylon, naming the sirens. And so this is like a personal judgment on him. It's like this religious thing suddenly that Everett of all people is appealing to. Like the story about how this happened is that God judged him and let him be turned into a toad or something like that, which is bizarre coming from Everett. I don't know where that's... And it's right before he meets the Bible salesman who... And then, of course, the Bible salesman says, coming back to the answers thing, I've got the book with all the answers. And Everett doesn't protest to that, right? He doesn't say, no, I don't trust those answers. That's just religion or something. He just goes along with it. So I don't know. Everett's complicated. It's hard to figure out just what's going on with him.
I mean, one thing about him and Reason is he is just instrumental with his friends, so he certainly buys into instrumental reasons. And even in that case with the judgment on Delmar, that's like, you do this, you get that, result. And what he's after is a kind of instrumental project to recover, his family. So even though he says he's like, an abstract thinker, he's really very much of a cunning instrumentalist when it comes to the world. And that's what he bumps up against, I think.
I want to talk about Everett's genuineness and authenticity, but I want to save that for when we talk about character observations. But we might as well just jump right now. Let's pick up that nihilism thread and move over into Coen Brothers themes. What do you guys... all I had was a question mark, so why don't you two battle it out and I can observe.
Well, it's not so much... So when the Coen Brothers things, first of all, I just wanted to quick say two little fun allusions where, of course, the pomade ties back to Raising Arizona. Remember, they get out of prison and they get out the pomade.
Sniffing the pomade always gets you caught. That's what I've learned. Never use pomade if you're on the run.
Yeah, that's right. Nice. And with the Judas Iscariot accusation, when Pete accuses his brother of being Judas, Pete, we know, was the Jesus in the very last film. And so it's kind of, it doubles the meaning of that.
Very good.
So about Sheriff Cooley, I think nihilism is a theme that appears in a lot of their films. Of course, it's explicit in The Big Lebowski in a comic way. Then there's, the wood chipper and what's his name, Carl in Fargo. There's the Dark Rider of the Apocalypse in Raising Arizona. There's the tornado at the end of The Serious Man. There's just, Visser and his pistol in Blood Simple. So I'm just alive to looking for it. And I do think there's an ambiguity about Sheriff Cooley in many ways, which of course Troy's about to point out to me. But I think, when he talks about the law at the end, because they say to him, look, the governor has pardoned us. We suddenly find out here's a lawman who doesn't really care about the law. He says it's a human institution, as opposed to what? Well, are we talking about divine law there? But if he's, he doesn't obey divine law, maybe because he's devilish. And so he's in rebellion against divine law. But it could also just be that he just doesn't recognize any kind of law except for his desire for revenge and punishment and sadism. So I think you can see him as devilish with his association with fire, with his dark eyes, with his dog, and it connects with Tommy Johnson's description of the devil seems to match Sheriff Cooley. But still, I think that explicit rejection of law by a lawman is a nihilistic gesture. And yeah, after we saw the torture of Pete as well, too, like there's a kind of just sadism in that. I'm sure he's trying to get information, but he's also clearly a sadistic guy. And with the allusion, of course, to Cool Hand Luke and the guard there.
The boss man.
The boss man who takes out Luke at the end and, is a clearly deadly merciless killer.
Troy, I can see you on the screen. I think that you might have a disagreement about the role that nihilism plays in the film. What do you got going on?
I did earlier today. I got to say, I think maybe now I'm having a disagreement with myself more than with Peter. I'm not sure what to think about this. Look, first thing I want to, it's so complicated, here's the nature, first of all, of my reservation that I thought I felt more strongly earlier today, which was I worried that maybe our esteemed professor, colleague Peter Fossil, is equating nihilism with evil or something like that. Like every time somebody's bad, so we can list all these evil characters in their films. And I don't know that they're all nihilistic. I don't want to be crazy. I want to be careful about that. I do think certainly some of them are. I think that Chigurh, for instance, from No Country for Old Men is clearly nihilistic.
Oh, of course.
Yeah. Well, he's got his own weird code, right? But I think it's nonetheless a kind of a nihilistic code, but
perverse.
Yeah. On the point of lawmen not caring about the law, and this is something actually we could have brought up in social political themes, this is something where the U.S. is going to see very shortly, right? If it has, I'm sure in some ways it has already by this point, when, the Supreme Court, for instance, starts ordering segregation, there's going to be plenty of governors and lawmen and so on who go against that and say, well, the Supreme Court said so, it's the law of the land. So what? We're not going to do that here. We're not going to segregate our schools, right? And so I see Sheriff Cooley in a way in this moment as kind of prefiguring that sort of thing that soon is going to be happening in the American South. And again, like I say, in some ways,
Nice.
yes.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah.
And then I think about those particular people. Are they nihilistic? Well, I doubt that all of them are, because I think some of them, and this is not to praise them, because I think the moral codes that they were going by were so awful, but they did truly believe in some way they were doing the right thing, right? That by opposing segregation, that they were standing up for God's law or something like that, and protecting, the innocent white women or white people or whatever, white children, right? Whatever it was. It's a terrible thing to think. And so, I'm not in any way praising them by saying that. I think that having a bad morality can be as bad as having no morality at all in some cases. And this is probably one. But I do think some of these people, it would be wrong to characterize them as nihilistic. But then also, I suspect some of the other ones probably we could, that it wasn't a moral thing. It was just a power thing and nothing else. A power thing combined with some sort of a, racism that was so primitive or pure or brute, whatever, that you couldn't even consider it a moral stance. It was just, an odious character trait, essentially. So probably some of those people were. And I have to admit, as I was thinking today about this question, mulling it over in preparation for this, that I started to think, that I can see Cooley as representing nihilism in a way. I'm thinking again about that one line he says, which I think Peter just mentioned, right? The law is a human institution and what that means. And I've always tended to read that on the level of that he's some sort of a supernatural force. He's a little like the Dark Rider of the Apocalypse in Raising Arizona or whatever it is. He's not going to lower himself down to the level of humanity. He doesn't care that these guys are innocent now. They're pardoned by legal authorities. He's going to do what he wants to do because he has the power to do that. And it is, again, a kind of a supernatural power. And that to me then makes him not nihilistic, but something else. But then I am also open, and more open as I think about it, to the reading that, again, no, look, he's just a human being who has power because of this position he happens to be in. Which, again, as I was saying a little earlier, they're out in the woods, there's nobody around, he's in a position, he's got the guns, he and his men have the guns, they can do what they want. And he just doesn't care. And so on this reading, emphasizing the human and human institution, or maybe he's emphasizing institution in a way too, right? This is just something we've made up. That is, this being society, right, or the law. That's nothing more in this view than something we've made up to make life easier for us in certain ways. And it's got no real authority. And so
exactly.
If you can get away with...
Especially out here.
They're in like Miller's Crossing. Right? They're out in the woods. This is where things happen, and there's nobody around to say it can't happen. You find it's the Hobbesian state of nature, right? If you find yourself in that position, you can do what you want. And if you're a nihilist, there's nothing that's going to stop you. So from that reading, as I was thinking about it, I actually started to think, no, Peter's onto something here. Like there really is a natural way of reading these events in this film that has him as kind of, I don't know if I'd say a representative of nihilism. It's more like it's somebody who is a nihilist in terms of how they think and what they do. And that, again, I might prefer, if I had to say what happened and interpret what's about to happen, I would go with Everett McGill and say, why does the flood that rescues them happen? Well, because again, there's a perfectly naturalistic explanation. It's been scheduled for some time. Okay, why does it happen at just that moment? Why does it only save them and doesn't seem to save the evil lawmen? Pure luck, right? Nothing else. It's a nihilistic universe, and that means it's ruled by chance. And sometimes chance breaks in the right way. I mean, a nihilistic universe isn't going to always do the wrong thing. It's chance. So sometimes the chance will be with you.
That's right.
That's what happens here. Isn't it wonderful? So again, we don't know, right? And in fact, this controversy about how to explain what happens is voiced by the characters themselves after they come to the surface and they're clinging to their coffins and so on. They're saying, look, God, obviously, you yourself, Everett, you prayed, we heard you. God stepped in and saved us. And Everett at that point takes the other side and says, no, there's a perfectly naturalistic explanation and so on, right? Rational, blah, blah. So the controversies in the film itself, the film doesn't decide it for us.
Yes, I agree.
But
yeah.
But Peter, yeah, so that's a long way of saying it. I find myself more sympathetic to your view that you can see this film as having a kind of a nihilism in it and a recognition of nihilism. That's, again, the legal institutions and, in fact, society and civilization in general is something we've made to try to make authority because there's no natural authority already in the world. It's us trying to create that.
I'm not going to go that far. I think it's interesting. Again, Peter, I think you raise an interesting possibility. I'm not reducing it to saying evil is not nihilistic. I think the way that you fleshed it out, Troy, especially makes it a possibility that you can put a nihilistic read on it. I do think that we've learned something from the Coen brothers, and that is even National Socialism is an ethos, right? So you can be pretty damn evil and still not be a nihilist, according to the Coen brothers. So I just want to resist was Hitler a nihilist? According to Walter, no, he wasn't. He had an ethos. As long as you have an ethos. So does Sheriff Cooley have an ethos? I kind of think he does. It's might makes right, might be. I don't know. I'm on the fence. I'm going to say I'm officially on the fence on the nihilism read.
I like the ambiguity reading.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, Coen Brothers themes. The floor is open. We've settled the nihilism question. Conclusively settled that to be ambiguous. What Coen Brothers themes? What do we got? Anything else you want to? I got a few on my list, but yeah.
You want to start with one, Robert?
All right. Well, these are kind of short, so I don't need to. These are less discussion points, more observations of Coen Brothers themes. Okay, escaped convicts. We've seen this before in Raising Arizona. Hayseeds speaking eloquently in educated turns of phrase. We've seen that in Raising Arizona. Hayseeds itself. I think this was the Hayseed trilogy. They were Blood Simple. I read somewhere. Did you guys read this? That as early as 1987, the Coen brothers were envisioning a movie set in the Deep South that would complete their Hayseed trilogy. Right. So I didn't realize it went back that far, but I guess they were thinking about the Hayseed trilogy. So that's another Coen brothers theme is, the buddy movie, the friendship, masculinity. Again, another theme that we see in, I want to say all of their films, but I could be wrong, but most of them. And critique of capitalism and sort of an acknowledgement of class and distinctions. So those are what I had listed for a Coen brothers theme. So I just wanted to go through the list, unless you wanted to pick up on anything.
The characters have some interesting observations or perceptions and beliefs about class and so on. I'm thinking again, for instance, about that campfire theme where you hear their dreams and what they're going to do when they get the money. And Pete's dream is to own a restaurant. And he perceives this as giving him legitimacy. And it's interesting. He's not just going to be the owner.
Especially being maitre d'.
Right. He wants to work in the restaurant. Like he's going to own this place.
He wants to wear a tuxedo.
But yeah, he's going to work there. Like his imagination sort of doesn't go to the place where, I'll just own it and make the money. I'll be the capitalist reaping it. No, I'm going to be employed in this place. And I'm going to be the maitre d'. And I'm going to wear the tuxedo. And then he says, it's such a touching line, I think. He says, I'll get all my meals for free. I think that's so beautiful. I can eat free there because it's my restaurant, right? Like you don't have to buy, if you have that much money, you don't have to buy a restaurant to get free meals. But that's how his mind works. But it also gives him this kind of legitimacy. And I think that, people are going to come in and say hi. And he's this classy guy. He's got his tuxedo. And then Delmar, I already mentioned, is going to use the money to buy back the family farm because in his mind, legitimacy means owning property and getting the banks back. There's that little element of revenge in it too. And then Everett is always pretending to be somebody or being somebody he's not actually entitled to be. It goes back to that question of authority too. We learn that the real reason he was in prison was for practicing law without a license. And there's a great moment very near the end when he's talking to Penny, still trying to convince her at this point that he is bona fide and he's trying to win her back. He's up on stage. I think maybe it's right before they sing Man of Constant Sorrow because they haven't realized yet that this is their ticket to actual success. He says to her, I got big plans, not minstrelsy, he says. He's wearing the fake beard and everything right up on stage. He says, this here is just a dodge. I'm going to be a dentist. I know this guy will print me up a license. So first of all, it's so good. The idea that he's going to go from practicing law without a license to taking people's teeth out without a license and that's a step forward and it's going to convince her is fantastic. But also his perception of that as being legitimate, right? Oh, that's a real profession. That's something that'll really.
Right.
Doesn't somebody say something about whether they'll be recognized as a real band or something?
Yes, as they're going up on stage, I think Pete says, nobody's going to buy that we're a real band or something like this. But which is also interesting. And of course, it makes so much sense that if
they're not bona fide.
I mean, they sang a
wearing
song. They're,
costumes.
yeah, right, because of the beards, right? I guess that's people are going to see through that, but it doesn't matter, right? It is the music, and I mean the irony of Everett's journey to ultimate success is that he finds success in an area where you don't need a license, you don't need approval to sing songs and stuff. You just need people to like him and buy your records. So, he could have planned for or shot for something like that all along. And instead he kept on practicing these things, without getting the education and the training. But in the end, he gets this weird kind of legitimacy from a totally unexpected source.
Other Coen Brothers themes we want to lay out there.
Robert, did you mention the bags of cash? We always see bags of cash in their films.
Good point.
Often without bags, without actual cash in them, but this one is full of cash. Also, I think we've mentioned in the past how often those bags of cash or the cash itself end up flying into the landscape in some way. And sure enough, in this case, the George Nelson's satchel full of cash is open. He hasn't bothered to zip it up, I guess. And so it's just flying around and flying out the car window. It's all over the place.
Isn't it weird that there are $2 bills flying?
They're like a ton.
It's
You
very
don't
odd.
see those very much anymore. The $2
I know.
bills.
Yeah, I looked up whether or not there were $2 bills in 1937, and there were.
There were, okay. Well,
Yeah.
that'd be worth a fair bit back then. Also, fake treasures, MacGuffins, and so on, and where, the Tiresias immediately says, you're not going to find the treasure you're looking for. It turns out it doesn't even exist. But seems often the case in Coen Brothers films that they're after one thing, and really it turns out they're going to find something else. The out-of-control gun, I feel like I've seen a few times.
Well, Troy, that topic, the gun without a shooter. We saw the same thing in The Big Lebowski.
Yes.
This is the second, because I was thinking about Troy's theme of the person who shoots the gun tells you a lot about the character, and I thought this is the second gun shooting without a shooter. And I thought, what's Troy's theory you say about a shooterless shooting gun?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, usually
It's not popcorn.
It's not popcorn. It's such a great, because it sounds like popcorn. So it's such a great line.
And weirdly, he calls upon St. Christopher too. He says,
That's right.
"Holy
Holy
St. Christopher's the
Yeah.
patron saint of travelers." I don't know if that was right, but
I don't know what that was about. I don't know. But the gun that's out of control means somebody's lost control of their gun, basically. And so in Big Lebowski, of course, it's Walter who, fancies himself what would you call it, an action hero of some sort, but in fact can't keep control of his gun. In this case, it's the cops. They're not in control of their guns. They lose control of the situation. Things catch on fire. The van catches on fire, and all these guns start going off. And in fact, interestingly about this film, so my general Coen gun rule is, when somebody fires a gun, that moment is crucial to giving you an insight into their character. In this case, most of them don't have guns. The only people who have guns other than are criminals like Babyface Nelson. He might be the only one. And then the cops.
The kid. The kid has a gun.
Does the kid have a gun?
that's right. The kid.
Okay. Well, yeah, he
whatever
shot the
cousin.
tax guy. That's true. Okay.
He shoots at them, and
So
in fact,
the
he
kid.
said
I'm glad.
he nicked a banker
He nicked
the
the
week
bank
before
guys.
that.
So he's the one
banker.
character who actually has control of his gun and doesn't shoot
census guy.
indiscriminately. He shoot. I mean, you might think shooting a census guy is not a good thing to do, but he doesn't fire indiscriminately the way all these other people do, because the cops with their machine guns and stuff are just going nuts. They're shooting bullets all over the place, and so is George Nelson. I mean, he even shoots the cow and stuff like that. So I was thinking you don't see anybody in this film, but you're right about the kid who I forgot about.
I love how they have the cow at the end of.
Yeah.
It's weird, but with the Nelson there, as they're bringing him in, it looks like a lynch mob.
Mm-hmm.
But then they say he's going to give him the electric chair, which is I know there were kind of legal lynchings too, but it was strange. I thought the way they staged that, it reminded you of the Klan and the execution there. So
Yeah, it's weird to have a parade.
but then at
for
the
a
end comes
guy.
the cow. That was so great. I thought.
The return of the cow is wonderful, along with the return of George, and all these characters do come back. You see him again. Yeah, but anyway, other than that, and I wondered about why it was that none of the main characters had guns. They're all sort of pacifists or like they never try even to get guns, right? It never seems to occur to them that, that might be a good idea to protect ourselves out here. They seem to have no interest in that. So that was the Coen gun rule for this one. Not a lot of application here because most characters don't have guns, but it does speak to the violence and I think inherent corruption of the police force that we see in this film.
The music soundtrack, which, as everyone who knows about this knows that, like I said at the beginning, this basically caused a cultural phenomenon at least in the United States, with a revival, very appropriate word given the film, a revival of sort of Americana roots folk music. The album, from what I read, it went platinum 8 times, eight platinum, which I believe is 8 million sales.
Really?
Yeah,
That's wild.
8 times platinum. And then there was a film made afterwards, what's it called, Down from the Mountain, I think it was, which was all the musicians in the film went on tour, and that thing was it really did change the culture. My understanding is that, it opened the door to folk music for people who had not paid attention to it. So the Coen brothers, again, making their mark.
Yeah, it's crazy it was that successful. And of course, there's no way they could have known. And I don't get the feeling they were aiming at that, but they did do a great job. And of course, T-Bone Burnett, who this is the first time they worked with him. Is that right? Because he goes on to collaborate with them a few times and did such great work, obviously. I mean, deserves a lot of the credit for the huge success.
Didn't he work on the Big Lebowski, actually?
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So it wouldn't have been as extensive, but yeah, that makes sense. And the Big Lebowski, as we noted when we talked about that, was really the first time they had a soundtrack, that gathered a bunch of, in that sense of gathering works by a bunch of different artists, as opposed to using mostly music composed by their regular composer, Carter Burwell, who sort of took a back seat on both of these. And it is a wonderful album, so.
Oh, it really is. I just think they could have gotten more black musicians.
Yep, agreed.
Songs, but, it's a great album.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting, there's a few things, little interesting tidbits, which is that most of the music, I would say all, I'm not 100% sure, but a vast majority of the music is, period specific music. It was music from that time. It wasn't,
right.
I don't think there was any songs that were written for the film that were used.
I did want to ask you about the opening and closing, because, we often talk about that, Robert. So the last thing, during the credits, you get that sunny side, keep on the sunny side thing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you think that's ironic. And it begins with Lazarus, a song, a spiritual or chain gang song about Lazarus.
Which, interesting tidbit about that, that's an actual recording from the 50s from Mississippi,
really?
A prison. That is Alan Lomax, who's a great, one of the great archivists of American folk culture and music. He recorded that in the 50s of a chain gang in Mississippi. So that is an actual chain gang singing and hitting stones. Yeah. Huh. Anyway, I'm sorry, you were saying about...
No, I just wondered what you thought about those. I think, Lazarus clearly about, but if you listen to the lyrics, so Lazarus, somebody's risen, but then like the chief deputy, the high sheriff, tells the lower sheriff to go get him. And he says at the end, he's not going to go get Lazarus.
Yeah.
And so Lazarus goes free at the end of that one. Whereas it's just, it's when I hear that keep on the sunny side thing, I thought about Monty Python, like look on the bright side of life, and the irony that's drenched in. And I wondered if you thought there was anything like that.
Yeah, I took that as of having classic Coen brothers irony.
Yeah.
But also, again, returning to what I was saying about the It's a Wonderful Life interpretation. That there is a sense in which, given everything he's been through, and this is the sunny side of life for him to have all his daughters and be in this. And what's interesting is that town at the end is you see black folk, so it's an integrated town, which is odd.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
But I think that the soundtrack. The soundtrack. That it covers, it does cover gospel and Delta blues, but like you said, it's mostly folk, white country and bluegrass. But one of the things I wanted to say, I mentioned earlier in the lightning round, is that, and this is where the comparison to Sullivan's Travels comes in, at the end of course, the moral of the story of Sullivan, what Sullivan learns is that, instead of this highbrow project that he wants to work on to make this film, which we haven't mentioned, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? That's the film he wants to make, where it's, the strife of the common man, and the whole film is him going out and experiencing. But, he comes to this revelation, right, that, no, it's through comedy that people, many, especially those experiencing hardship, that's the way that it gives them a reprise from the suffering. And the parallel with Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Is that we have the same message, but it's through this music, right? It's through the music of the culture and of the community, and that's going back to my point about why the audience is crazy about the Soggy Bottom Boys, is because it's the music that alleviates the ills of the culture. It's a powerful force that can be a kind of antidote for the ills of the culture. So it's a unifying theme, right? And I think it was Erica Rao. I think she thinks the music has a kind of democracy. There's a great equalizer. The levels. Anyone can enjoy that music, regardless of your class or status. Or I think that was an interesting point that she made.
That's a really interesting point. I mean, she's always good. Her book on the Coens is so great. Yeah, there is something about music. Once modern recording techniques and technologies are available, that it just becomes available to most people in a way that, more quote unquote elite art forms, the opera, live theater, whatever, are just not going to be. You have to go there to see, or even seeing art museums, great for the people in New York, but if you don't live close by, not so easy to go see that. Whereas recorded music, and of course the movies would be another example, they get out everywhere. You go see Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? In your local theater, assuming you still have one, and you're seeing the same movie they're seeing in New York or LA. So there is something, and I think, of course, music.
You sound like Barton Fink to me.
I got a little Barton in me, I can't help myself.
A writer for the people.
For the people, that's right.
Well, look, now that I brought that up, it dawns on me that there is the Sullivan's Travels theme in Barton Fink as well, right? I'm going to use the theater to tell the story of the common man.
Right, that's
right?
True. And
why didn't I think of that when we were talking about Barton Fink?
It didn't occur to me either, but you're so right, obviously, yes. That's great. But I do think, one of the things this film gets really right, too, is that the history, the political history of this country and race relations and so on, you have to talk about popular culture. You have to talk about music maybe more than any other, because that pop music, in this country so much comes out of blues, it comes out of jazz. It puts black artists in front of audiences. It puts their recordings in people's ears. People who don't care about it one way or the other, aren't thinking about it, may be drawn in and, start to realize, oh, these people really have something to offer to the culture. And, you can talk about athletics this way too. That's another huge force, right? Black athletes. These are two of the most important ways in which Black people were integrated into larger society, and how prevailing attitudes were changed a lot of the time. And I think this movie doesn't make a big point of that, but it's certainly there. And especially in that final, not quite final, but the scene with them playing the music. Again, it's 3 white guys and only 1 black guy. So, but nonetheless, the fact that they don't care, as Papi O'Daniel makes the point, right? The audience doesn't care that they're integrated. They just like the music. I think that does stand for something that was quite big in the larger culture that has been very important over the years.
You could argue there's an interesting lesson about anti-racism in there, and that is, don't wait for it to come to you from on high. It's going to have to come, from
the people
like prisoners and workers and ordinary people. It's not going to. That's where the action has to be.
Yeah.
There's one more. There's also the flip side, which is that the black musicians, and this is represented in the film when you go to the WEZY and you sing into a can, you get $10. But who makes all the money? The money is made by the record producer, the distributor, and there's a long, ugly history of black musicians being exploited, and they go in as, they sort of paid a fee, as if they're like a contractor, and then all the money is made by the record company. Yes. So there's
yeah, that
that.
happened to the true Tommy Johnson, right?
Oh, really?
The true Tommy Johnson. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we didn't even mention that. There actually was a Tommy Johnson who claimed to have sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads. And then Robert Johnson's most famous for that. But Robert Johnson, and if you go down, if you've been down to Mississippi, you can go to the crossroads. There's a sign there. You can go to the point where that spot where
Is that right?
he supposedly, there's a little,
Wow.
they got to make some money. It's a touristy thing.
Huh.
The other thing I wanted to say about
Robert,
music
can I
is-
just interject
Oh,
while
sure,
we're on
please,
that?
yeah.
I just wanted to say, of course, we're going to see a version of that story a few films down the road when we come to
yes.
Inside Llewyn Davis, because he's going to sign away the rights to his that silly novelty song that he does, and
That's
lose
true.
a lot of money to the company by doing that. So
Good point. The last thing I wanted to mention about the music is that, like you mentioned, actually, T-Bone Burnett did the music for The Big Lebowski, and as well for Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? But one difference, I think it's important. Oh Brother, Where Art Thou is not technically a musical. It's kind of like on the fringe of being. It kind of has musical-esque kind of aspects. But one of the things that is, to note is that the songs are, what they call diegetic. So the music, in The Big Lebowski, it's the music that's in the background or it's on the radio, in the case of the Eagles. But in this film, the music is in the actual setting of the film. So that's an interesting change for the Coen brothers, where it's almost all the music is diegetic. So that's an interesting point for them.
And the way the
Coen.
music is, again, to use the word integrated, not in its political sense in this case, but the way it's incorporated and integrated into the scenes in the film is just wonderful. I mean, they do such a nice job. And it's often the case that you hear the music before you see what's happening and you hear the singer, like in The Sirens, for instance. It's wonderful. They're driving down the road and Pete starts going crazy because he can hear it, right? And he tells Delmar to stop playing banjo. And he runs, they stop and he runs out of the car because he knows what's going on. And they run down to the river and then you see these three women. The music sort of infiltrates first and you realize you're hearing something before you know what it is that you're hearing. And they do versions of that several times through the film.
That's nice, yeah.
It's really lovely, I think, the way they get music into this film, what they do with it.
Yeah.
It's very amazing how those three sirens by the river, they have incredible reverb on their voices too. That was just amazing.
Well,
to me.
if you go and sing by the river, that's what it's like. You haven't realized,
That's
Robert. Rivers are great for.
Those scenes in cartoons when the characters, like, they're really hungry and there's like a steak and the smell comes to their nose and they start like floating in the air towards that reminded me of when Pete says, "Stop the car," because he almost sort of levitated as he had to get down there.
There was a certain supernatural quality.
Yeah.
Because of course they couldn't know that the car's driving by, who's in it. And I like the whiskey jug. That was a nice little.
No, that was right out of the cartoons, right?
Yeah,
Well, the movie
the
is it is cartoonish,
It is.
and
It's one of the
that's why I
joys
think
of
it's in
it,
the same
yeah.
universe as Raising Arizona
Yes.
in that sense. I think this is a really good time to pivot to our last topic: cinematic plot, character observations. Who wants to? Petey, what do you say? You want to take that one?
Okay, hang on a second here.
Damn, he's got pages.
There we go.
Yeah, I know. We could be here a while.
Sorry. I was writing notes as I was watching these. So we should talk about the Wizard of Oz. You guys started talking about that before we started recording, so I'm going to let you pick up on that. But I think Apocalypse Now. The travel up the river to get Kurtz, and I think Easy Rider was another one. I thought it's a road movie where you're. It's heavily associated with music, and there's a kind of odyssey through the American countryside that happens there. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the first one, there's an odyssey through the Vietnam War and all these set pieces that go on there, and it's arguably there isn't a treasure found in the way that they thought. Raising Arizona, of course, we were talking about it. On the Road, I know there's a movie version, but we should probably just talk about the book too. I think this is clearly. There's an element of, there is a trajectory here, but so much of that film is about being on the road. And I think that's the case here too, in some ways. I mean, even if they'd never gotten back. And even if it hadn't been resolved, I feel like I would have been satisfied with the trajectory of the film. And maybe Raiders of the Lost Ark for a film that, gets to an end point where there's a treasure that's found, a different kind of treasure. But you have... So those are the ones that came to mind. But it's not all that deep, I have to say, But maybe you could help me with that. Those are mine to bring up.
Nice.
I don't know, Robert. What do you think?
I have a little list here. I can tick off my cinematic plot character observations. I'll tick mine off. So one is to note that this is the second time that John Goodman plays an unscrupulous salesman. The first one, of course, being Barton Fink. We already mentioned the pomade. That's another. And then the question is like, does vanity? I mean, because he's pretty vain. Who the hell wears a hairnet? An escaped convict. He's worried about a hairnet. So, maybe the Coens are telling us that vanity gets punished. But I did see the special features, and Ethan's
Jesus wears a hairnet.
Jesus wears a hairnet.
Not
I'd say it's not for vanity purposes though. It seems like he's doing that because it's like a prison thing. I think.
I love how he sleeps in it.
He sleeps in. Yeah. Do you have one? And he goes, yeah, my wife has one, and she's got a bunch of. Does vanity get punished? And in the special features, they were talking. Ethan says, we love working with George. What people don't know, despite how he looks, he's just a goofball, right? So he's apparently as good looking as he is, which in this film, I have to say, George Clooney is at his top of his game. He's very handsome. And because sometimes I'm like, wait a second, how could a scruffy dude run out of prison look that good, But anyway, I just wanted to mention one of my favorite parts of dialogue. As a philosopher, as an argument, this is one of my favorite parts of dialogue. Everett says, that's another thing. Why are you telling our gals that I was hit by a train? And she says, a lot of respectable people have been hit by trains. Judge Hobby over in Cooksville was hit by a train.
That was great.
that was brilliant. The Coen brothers, I love that. Just a few more I have, the reference to Moby Dick with the coffin popping up, which Queequeg's coffin, of course, pops up and saves them.
Nice.
Okay. I had read that the name Odysseus means the son of pain. And so that is the man of constant sorrow. Huh. That is actually just
nice.
That's a stand-in for the name.
Wow.
Odysseus. As far as films the film that I thought of was the Defiant Ones with Tony Curtis and Sidney Poitier. And so I started looking into this, and of course Erica Rowell talks about this, but what I didn't notice that I had to read was at one point Everett says, he's trying to be encouraging to Pete, who's feeling hopeless, and he says, "Consider the lilies of the goddamn field." Now, Lilies of the Field is a very famous movie that starred Sidney Poitier, so I think that there was a little reference there.
Nice.
Let's see. The last thing I want to say is, speaking to Everett's character, and you get the sense, or I should say, I get the sense that Everett he's kind of a con man in a way. I mean, he's a con man with a heart of gold, right? He wouldn't harm you physically, but he's deceptive. And whenever you're dealing with Everett, where's the real Everett? Where is there the real, how far deep do I have to go to find the authentic Everett? And here's what I want to say. I want to say, it seems to me that the one time you get the genuine Everett, ironically, is the moment when he's on his knees asking God to get them, right? He says, I got to go back and see my kids. I want Pete and Delmar to survive. But I couldn't think of another scene in the movie where I thought, there's the genuine Everett. There he is. And he's praying, which I think is ironic since he's the skeptic.
Yeah, and he appeals to both friendship and family, so he's gotten out of himself for a change. Yeah. Maybe that's a moment of transformation, for him.
Can you think of another scene where you feel like, I'm finally seeing the real Everett? Because I really couldn't, except for that scene.
I really like that. Yeah, I think it says something too, like I keep the theme of Raising Arizona and like the establishment of family. There's there's lost children and regained children and the promise of children and yeah, I think you're onto something there.
Well, I saw the flood in that moment, if I may interject.
Yeah.
Here's what I was seeing going on is that Everett is genuinely and sincerely asking the Lord for salvation, literal salvation, not spiritual salvation.
Yeah.
And then he's immediately baptized. He's baptized by
Wow.
by
I
the
like
water.
it.
That's where the
Yeah,
baptism
he's the one who
takes
doesn't get
place.
baptized in the earlier scene, but eventually, when the chips are down, he does it. Yep,
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Nice. Holy cow. You guys are really picking up on the religious theme.
Hey, man, you know what? I got to
It's
tell
hard
you,
believe.
speaking of cow, I don't know about you. That cow shooting scene, that was disturbing to me.
It disturbed me too. It
It's
really
very
did.
disturbing.
I found it disturbing.
Yeah, it's a little upsetting. I got this, even not knowing it's real. Obviously, it's a little upsetting. Yeah.
Troy, I didn't mean to. You had things to say, and I was talking over you.
Oh no, did I?
I thought you had some cinematic plot character.
Oh well, I'll
observations.
just mention a couple really quick, but mostly just stuff I liked. And there's so much in this film. If I start quoting lines of dialogue, I'll be here all day. There's so many good lines, but I have to mention, and it's largely because of the delivery. Tim Blake Nelson, who's so great in this role. Oh my God. I mean, all three of the main actors are wonderful. His delivery of the line about the whole gopher village right before the baptism scene is so good. It just makes me laugh hysterical every time. And the whole gopher bit is great too, because it's, that line gets quoted a lot about the, a third of a gopher would just rouse my appetite without settling it down, right? Which is a great line to quote. But then it's followed by, he says, no, you can have a whole one. We each had one. We found a whole gopher village. I cannot do it. It is amazing. I really love that. I also love, we've mentioned the character Pappy Daniel, but we haven't mentioned he's played by the actor Charles Durning, who is so good. And in particular, his dancing in that scene where he gets up on stage with, man, his dancing is incredible. And
he's got some moves.
He's got some, and the dancing by all of the characters, up on the stage when they launch into their dance.
To Toro, I was like, what the hell was he doing?
Where is that stuff coming from? Oh my God.
That was almost as good as Elaine's dance in Seinfeld. That was up there. Oh, Troy, I just thought of something. You mentioned Tim Blake Nelson, who's awesome in this. And what I didn't mention, we should have mentioned, is he does his own singing in the film. He's the only one who's actually
right.
singing.
Of the three of them, they couldn't do the other two, sadly. But he does do his own singing. And he sounds good.
Well, you know what's amazing to me is throughout the entire film, I mean, how does he keep such a stupid looking face on? Sometimes his face it's like the platonic form of a dumbass. He has this look on his face where you're like, he's totally confused about everything.
I do have to wonder how many times one of the Coen brothers eventually said, okay, cut, let's do it again. Tim, stupider, more ignorant.
Oh, you gotta love you gotta love Delmar.
He's an amazing character. No, I do. I did notice this time around that in the Klan rally scene, again, an amazing scene in so many ways. Whatever it is they're singing, and I can't hear all of it, but at the beginning, they seem to be singing "Oh hi, oh hi, oh hi, oh," something like that. "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo." Right? Is that what they're? Which, of course, probably most of our listeners know that, but maybe a few don't. This is a children's nursery rhyme type thing. It's used in a lot of games. And there's a very racist version of it, which was prominent in the early part of the 20th century. So in the United States, not in England, apparently. This originated in England, had different words there, but when it migrated to the U.S. at some point, it transformed into this very racist version. So it makes a lot of sense that the Ku Klux Klan would be singing this.
Yeah. And you said how it connects to Wizard of Oz.
Yes, and so this, I think, is, since we haven't talked that, it's come up a couple of times, but I think there's at least a little more to say about that. This sequence is clearly modeled on a couple sequences from the Wizard of Oz, but I mean, if you play them side by side, which we've done, I mean, you can just see that this is not a coincidence. They clearly, both the scene with the three characters sort of looking into the rally from the top of the hill or wherever it is from the woods, and then the rally itself, the choreographing of that. There's a lot more people in the Coen Brothers Klan version, but it's modeled on a scene of some of the Wicked Witch's soldiers from Wizard of Oz, and there's no question about it. So, and this again is not the only point of contact, right, with Wizard of Oz. I mean, what else is there that you guys remember?
Going back to my outlandish theory about Edwina being Penny's granddaughter. The other theory I had is that Everett represents the Tin Man, and Delmar represents the Scarecrow, and Pete, he represents the Cowardly Lion. Did I develop it? No, I just thought of it. Everett is the guy without a heart. Delmar doesn't have a brain, and Pete is cowardly because he turns in his buddies.
Yeah, because
He does.
gives
That's
up under
true.
torture.
But
Yeah, I like that.
But Everett is also a little like the Scarecrow because he's afraid of fire. Because when the police are coming after them, they're in the barn and they're going to burn the barn down. He says twice, "I hate fire." So
that's true.
it's a little trick. I've been trying to do this too, to assign each of them, to one, but I can't quite do it cleanly. I think they may mix it up on purpose. But
There's wizards in it. There's several wizards.
there are wizards.
There's the clan wizard, and then there's the appeal. Like, we need a wizard to get Pete back from being a toad.
The Grand Wizard.
And it begins and ends in black and white. It's very quick. But like the Wizard of Oz, it begins with a black and white shot, which then fades into sepia tones. And then at the end, it kind of fades back into sepia tones. And then I think all the way to black and white and then cuts.
And Troy, you mentioned to me, I believe you mentioned that in both films, evil is destroyed by water.
That's right. The Wicked Witch is melted by water. Right after, I think she threatens the Scarecrow with fire. And in this one, it's the flood that washes Cooley away and presumably destroys him.
Thank you, Peter S. Fossil in Louisville, Kentucky. Thank you, Troy Jollymore in Chico, California. I'm Robert Jones. Thank you for listening. Thanks for hanging in there, tuning in to our podcast, No Podcast for Old Men. Our next episode, the 9th film, is that The Man Who Wasn't There? Am I right on that?
That is right, yep.
The Man Who Wasn't...
Can't wait.
It's got to be one of the lesser known yet great Coen Brothers films. So I think there's a lot philosophically to dig into on that one. So if you're listening to this, you have some time, now's a good time to go rent The Man Who Wasn't There, and we will bring that to you on the next episode. Until then, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you in a little while. Bye-bye.